She was the most feared CEO in New York. He was a broke single father who just needed a job. On his very first week, she stood in front of the entire board and told him, in front of everyone, that he didn't belong there, that he never would. Most men would have packed their desk and disappeared. Grayson Hale didn't move an inch. What happened next shocked the whole company. And what she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that this quiet, stubborn man was about to uncover a secret that would destroy everything she thought she'd built. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and follow along because you will not want to miss what comes next. The elevator doors opened on the 34th floor, and Grayson Hale stepped out carrying a paper coffee cup in one hand and a manila folder in the other, wearing a suit that fit well enough but not perfectly. The kind of suit a man buys when he needs to look like he belongs somewhere before he actually does. He had ironed it himself that morning at 5:45 while Mia slept, pressing the collar twice because the first time left a crease running the wrong direction. He'd had to reheat his coffee 3 times. Mia had woken up at 6 and asked him if she could have chocolate chips in her oatmeal. He'd said yes. It wasn't a battle worth fighting on a Monday. The 34th floor of Vaughn Media Group smelled like cold air and money. That specific combination, the aggressive air conditioning and the faint trace of expensive things, hit Grayson the moment he stepped off the elevator, and something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't let show on his face. He was 32 years old. He had a 7-year-old daughter, a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens that cost more than it should, and a resume that was genuinely good, not inflated, not borrowed, genuinely good, built from 8 years of grinding through mid-level creative director positions at companies that had either downsized, restructured, or simply stopped caring about the people who'd made them work. His last job had ended 6 months ago when the agency folded. The severance had lasted 4 months. The freelance work had helped, but not enough. He'd applied to 41 positions. Vaughn Media had called him back. He hadn't let himself feel too much about that. He'd learned not to. The reception area on 34 was all glass and steel and low ambient lighting that somehow made everything look slightly colder than it actually was. A young woman at the front desk, early 20s, dark blazer, hair pulled back so tight it looked deliberate, looked up when he approached. "Grayson Hale," he said. "I'm starting today. Creative strategy." She typed something without looking at him. "HR is on 26. You'll want to check in there first. Badge, paperwork, orientation packet." "I know. I was told to come here first. I have a 9 o'clock with Marcus Webb." She looked up now. Something shifted in her expression. Not unfriendly, just careful. "Mr. Webb's calendar got moved. There's a board meeting this morning. You're probably better off going to HR and coming back up after 11. Grayson glanced at the clock on the wall behind her. 8:53. "He specifically asked me to come to 34 at 9, Grayson said. He wasn't aggressive about it. He was just accurate. She hesitated. Then she typed something else and picked up her phone. He watched her speak quietly into it, her eyes moving to him once and then away. She hung up. "Someone will be right out," she said. The someone turned out to be a man named Derek Paulson, mid-40s, head of creative operations, the kind of guy who walked fast and talked faster and had the specific energy of someone who had survived multiple corporate reorganizations by always being useful without ever being threatening. He shook Grayson's hand with both of his. "Hale. Great. Glad you're here. Small thing, we've had a scheduling shift this morning. Board meeting got pushed to 9, so Marcus won't be available until after. I'm going to get you set up, show you your desk, and we'll get you into the room once things settle down." He was already moving. Grayson followed. "Board meeting," Grayson said. "Yeah, quarterly review. No big deal. Happens every—" Derek stopped walking for a fraction of a second, just barely, then kept going. "We'll get you set up on 28. That's where the creative strategy team sits. Good group. You'll like them." Grayson noticed the pause. He filed it away. His desk was in the middle of a large open floor on 28, glass walls on 2 sides. A view of Midtown that would have been impressive if he had time to look at it. Someone had left a Vaughn Media welcome packet on the desk. Glossy, heavy paper stock, the company logo embossed on the front. He set it aside without opening it. Derek introduced him to 3 people. Camille, late 20s, content strategy, who shook his hand and smiled and immediately went back to whatever was on her screen. James, early 30s, visual development, who was on a call and gave Grayson a nod and a small wave. And Thomas, who was apparently the senior lead on the team and who looked at Grayson for a beat too long before saying, "Welcome aboard," in a tone that had a question somewhere inside it. "You came from Mercer Creative?" Thomas asked. "Before that folded, yeah. I heard about that." Thomas leaned back in his chair. He was maybe 40, silver starting at his temples. The kind of guy who had been very good at something once and now managed people who were good at things. "What'd you work on there?" "Brand narrative development mostly, some campaign architecture, a few turnaround projects for clients who were in trouble." Thomas nodded slowly. "And Marcus pulled you in for what exactly?" "The Horizon Media pitch," Grayson said, "and the Northbridge relaunch." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Those are big accounts." "I know." There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds longer than it needed to. Then Thomas said, "Coffee machines by the window, kitchens down the hall, bathrooms to the left." He turned back to his screen. Grayson sat down. He opened his laptop, put in his temporary credentials from the HR email, and started reading through the Horizon Media brief that Marcus had sent him 2 days before his start date. He had already read it 3 times. He read it again. At 10:40, Derek reappeared at the edge of the floor and waved him over. "Marcus wants you up on 34. Meeting's running long, but he wants you in the room." Grayson closed his laptop, picked up his notepad, actual paper, an actual pen, not a tablet, because he thought better when he wrote by hand, and followed Derek to the elevator. The boardroom on 34 was a long rectangle of glass and pale wood, a table that could seat 20 comfortably, right now seating 14. Grayson counted without meaning to. There were faces he didn't recognize, faces he recognized from the company website, senior VPs, department heads, 2 people he was fairly sure were outside board members based on the way they were sitting slightly apart from the others, the way people sit when they're there to evaluate rather than participate. Marcus Webb stood at the far end, mid-50s, silver-haired, the kind of easy authority that comes from 20 years of being the second most important person in a room. He was speaking when Grayson entered. He looked up, nodded once, and gestured to an empty chair against the wall. Not at the table, against the wall, observer's position. And Grayson sat without making noise. For about 7 minutes, he listened to a presentation about Q2 performance metrics and the Northbridge account status. The numbers were not great. The account had been drifting for 8 months, losing market share in the 25 to 40 demographic, and the creative strategy presented so far had failed to arrest the slide. There was tension in the room about it, the kind of tension that had been building for a while and was looking for somewhere to go. And then Sienna Vaughn spoke. He had seen her photo. Of course he had. She was Sienna Vaughn, CEO of Vaughn Media Group, 30 years old, one of the youngest CEOs of a major media company in the country. The profile pieces had been written. The magazine covers had happened. He had formed some internal image from those things, some expectation. The reality was different in a way he couldn't immediately explain. She was sitting at the head of the table, and she had not said a word the entire time he'd been in the room. She had a legal pad in front of her with notes she'd made in small, precise handwriting. She had been listening in the particular way that some people listen. Not passively, not even quietly, but with a quality of attention that had weight to it, that made the air around her feel slightly different. She looked up from her notes and she spoke, and the room changed. Not dramatically, not in some cinematic way where everyone fell silent. They were already somewhat silent, but the specific quality of the silence shifted, the way a room shifts when the person who actually matters in it decides to participate. "The Northbridge brief has 3 core problems," she said. Her voice was even, not loud, not soft, just precise. "The demographic targeting is 6 months out of date. The visual language is reactive rather than forward positioning, and the campaign narrative assumes customer loyalty that the data does not support." She paused, "which means we've been building on a foundation that doesn't exist." Nobody argued with this. Some people wrote things down. Marcus nodded slowly. "We need a full reframe," she said. "Not a revision, a reframe. That means we start from the research. not from the existing creative. That's a significant timeline adjustment, said one of the VPs, mid-40s, name Grayson didn't have yet. I know, Sienna said. The client is expecting something at the end of the month. Then we need to have an honest conversation with the client, she said. Or we can show them something that doesn't work and have a more difficult conversation in 3 months. She looked at him steadily. Your choice. The VP didn't have a response to that. Then Sienna Vaughn looked at the chair against the wall where Grayson was sitting. It wasn't a long look. It was maybe 3 seconds. But it was the kind of look that covered ground fast, the kind of look that assembled and processed and reached a conclusion in the time it took most people to register they were being observed. Is this the new hire? She said, to Marcus, but looking at Grayson. Grayson Hale, Marcus said, starting today. I brought him in for Northbridge and Horizon. Hale, she said, and there was nothing friendly in it and nothing hostile either, just acknowledgement. She looked back at her notes. The Horizon brief has the same problem as Northbridge. The positioning framework assumes a market reality that's at least 2 quarters behind. If you're starting on that account, you need to rebuild the brief before you touch the strategy. It wasn't directed at him specifically, or rather it was directed at him, but in the same voice she'd used to direct something at the room. Informational, not a conversation, just a fact being placed in space. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Grayson listened and wrote and said nothing. Okay. He did not see Sienna Vaughn again until Thursday. In between, he did what he'd been hired to do. He read everything. He talked to Camille and James and a researcher named Priya who worked on the floor below and who actually seemed glad he was asking questions. He went through 3 years of Northbridge account data and 2 years of Horizon campaign performance. He made a timeline on paper, actual paper, taped to the wall of a small conference room he'd claimed on 28. And he stood in front of it for an hour on Wednesday afternoon just looking at it, the way you look at something when you're trying to understand its shape. Thomas walked past the conference room twice and looked in both times without stopping. On Thursday morning at 8:20, Grayson's access credentials stopped working. He stood at his desk for a minute, tried again, then called IT. They told him there'd been a system update and his permissions needed to be reissued. It would take a few hours. He went to the kitchen and got coffee and sat at a small table near the window and kept working on paper. At 9:15, Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway. There's a strategy session on 34. Marcus wants you there. Grayson picked up his notepad and his coffee and followed him up. The session was smaller than Monday's board meeting. 8 people around the table, Marcus, Thomas, 2 people from the accounts team, a woman named Harper, who ran client relations, and Sienna Vaughn, who was already seated and already writing something when Grayson walked in. He sat at the table this time. Proper seat, not observer chair. Marcus ran the first 20 minutes, a review of where the Northbridge campaign stood, what the client had communicated, what the internal timeline looked like. It was organized and thorough and described a situation that was manageable if you accepted its current framing. Grayson waited until Marcus reached the point where he laid out the proposed path forward. He listened to all of it. Then he said, I think we're solving the wrong problem. The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus looked at him, not unkindly. Walk us through that. The brief is built around reactivating lapsed customers, Grayson said. That's what the client asked for, and that's what we've been designing toward. But the data from the past 18 months says the lapsed customer segment isn't recoverable within the cost structure they've given us. The LTV doesn't support the acquisition spend. He turned his notepad around so Marcus could see the numbers he'd worked through. If we run this campaign as designed, we'll get the deliverable, we'll hit the launch date, and in 4 months the client will be looking at ROI that doesn't justify renewal. Thomas said, You've been here 3 days. I know, Grayson said. The brief has been in development for 2 months. I know that too. There was a beat of silence. Grayson kept his eyes on Marcus. What's the alternative? Marcus said. Shift the target to adjacent acquirables, new customers who look like their top existing segment. The CPM is higher up front, but the LTV projection is 3 times better. The campaign narrative changes significantly, but the timeline holds if we make the decision this week. Harper said, the client was very specific about lapsed customer focus. Then we need to show them why that focus isn't going to get them what they actually want, Grayson said, which is growth. They want growth. They asked for lapsed customer reactivation because someone told them that was the path. It might not be. The room had the specific quiet of people recalculating. And then Sienna said, "Show me the LTV projection." He slid his notepad across the table. She looked at it, not briefly. She actually read it, the numbers, the methodology he'd sketched in the margin. About 30 seconds. Then she looked up at Grayson. "This is a back-of-napkin model," she said. "Yes." "The assumptions are rough." "They are. I've been here 3 days and I don't have full data access yet. My credentials are down." He said this without complaint, just factual. But even with generous assumptions in the other direction, the direction holds. She looked at him for a moment. It was the same quality of look as Monday, assembling, processing. Something shifted in it this time, something subtle he couldn't fully read. "Build it out," she said. "Full model. I want it by Monday morning." "I can have it Friday afternoon," he said. She held his gaze for a half second. "Friday afternoon," she agreed. He had the model on her desk by 4:30 Friday. Not through Marcus, not through Derek. He walked it to 34 himself, asked the receptionist to put it in her office since she was in a meeting, and left. He picked up Mia from aftercare at 5:45. She ran at him the way she always did when he picked her up, like she'd been saving velocity all day just for this moment. And he caught her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and immediately started talking before he had her fully off the ground. "Emma had a birthday cupcake, and she brought enough for the whole class, and mine had sprinkles, but not the good kind, the flat kind, and we did fractions today, and I already knew all of them because you taught me on the cereal boxes, remember?" "I remember," he said. "So I got them all right. Miss Holloway asked me how I knew, and I said my dad taught me, and she said that was very nice." "It was very nice of me," Grayson agreed. Mia pulled back and looked at him with the specific scrutiny that 7-year-olds apply to things they genuinely care about. Her eyes were brown and very direct. She had his eyes. People said it all the time, and every time they did, there was a small, complicated thing that moved through him that he had learned to let move through without naming it. "How was your new job?" she said. "Good." "Did you make any friends?" He thought about Thomas looking at him with that careful, measuring look. He thought about Camille going back to her screen. He thought about Priya, who told him where the good coffee was on 28 and explained the office politics in the particular frank way of someone who had decided they didn't care about office politics. "It's too early for friends," he said. "But I think I made a good impression." Mia considered this seriously. "Or a bad impression?" "I'm genuinely not sure," he said. She nodded like this was an acceptable answer. Then she said, "Can we have tacos?" "We had tacos Tuesday." "Tacos are never repetitive," she said, with a certainty that suggested she had thought about this before. "Who told you that?" "I decided it myself." He laughed. An actual laugh, not a polite one. "Okay, tacos." Mat. The Monday meeting happened faster than he expected. He'd sent his model to Sienna's office Friday afternoon. He'd gotten an email at 9:15 Friday night. No greeting, no sign-off, just a reply to his model attachment that said, "Assumptions on churn rate in Section 3 are too conservative. Revise upward by 15 to 18% and rerun. Also, the campaign narrative sketch at the end. Expand that." What does the creative actually look like? He'd sat at his kitchen table after Mia was asleep and worked until 1 in the morning. He'd sent the revision at 1:47. He'd gotten a reply at 2:12. Better. Present Monday. So Monday morning he was on 34 at 9, and this time he was at the table with a proper seat, and he walked Marcus and the accounts team and Sienna through the full model. It took 40 minutes. Nobody interrupted him except Sienna, twice. Once to challenge a methodology assumption, and once to ask him to slow down on the campaign narrative section. When he finished, Marcus said, "This is strong work." Thomas, who had been brought into the meeting and was seated 2 chairs down from Grayson, said nothing. Sienna said, "I'm taking this to the client Thursday. Marcus, clear Hales Thursday afternoon." Marcus nodded. Grayson had not been told he'd be going to the client. He kept his expression neutral and said, "I'll have supporting materials ready by Wednesday." Sienna looked at him. That look again, the assembling one. Then she went back to her notes and the meeting moved on. The client meeting on Thursday was at Northbridge's offices in Midtown 47th floor of a building that was trying very hard to look modern. The Northbridge team consisted of their CMO, a man in his late 50s named Walter Crane, who had the particular energy of someone who had survived a lot by being agreeable, and 3 of his direct reports. Grayson presented the strategy shift. Sienna did not present. She sat at the side of the table and watched. Walter Crane asked 12 questions. Grayson answered 11 directly. The 12th, what makes you confident the adjacent acquirable segment will convert at the rate you're projecting? He answered honestly, we're not fully confident. That's why we're recommending a phased rollout with defined checkpoints. If the conversion rate underperforms in phase 1, we adjust before we've spent the full budget. Walter Crane looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Sienna. She said, the model is solid, Walter. More solid than what we brought you 2 months ago. Walter Crane said, you're telling me the last proposal wasn't the right approach. I'm telling you we have a better one, she said. No apology in it, no softening, just the fact. Walter Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right, let's talk phasing. On the way back to Vaughn Media in the car, they'd taken a car, not a cab, because apparently Sienna didn't take cabs. The silence lasted about 4 blocks before Grayson said, you let me take the full presentation. She was looking at her phone. Yes. You usually present yourself. She looked up at him. Usually. Why not today? She held his gaze for a moment. Because you built it. It's better when the person who built it presents it. She went back to her phone. It was good work. He didn't say anything to that. He looked out the window at the city moving past. The model's still got holes, she said, without looking up. I know. I'm working on Section 4. Section 4 and the retention variable in Section 6. She turned her phone face down on her knee. I looked at 3 years of their historical retention data last night. Your variable is off. How far off? I'll send you what I found. He looked at her. She was looking out the window now, the city reflected in her expression. Something in her face that was not warm exactly, but not cold either. Focused, maybe, the way certain people are focused when they're actually interested in something. She looked younger than she did in the boardroom. He hadn't expected that. You look at your employees' work on Friday nights and email them at 2 in the morning, he said. She glanced at him. One eyebrow moved a fraction. You answered at 2 in the morning. Fair point, he said. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face and was gone. She picked up her phone again. He looked back out the window. What? The confrontation he had been warned about, informally, obliquely, by Derek, who had mentioned it during Grayson's second week in a tone of someone flagging a known weather pattern, came on a Tuesday in his 3rd week, in the middle of an all-hands creative review on 34. There were 22 people in the room. Most of the creative and strategy leadership across the company. Grayson had been there for 18 days. The review was going through 5 campaigns, 2 in progress, 3 in development. Grayson was not presenting. He was in the room because Marcus had added him to the invite, and he was sitting toward the back, notepad open, listening. The 3rd campaign up was Meridian, a brand development project that had been in development for 4 months and was now being presented by a man named Christopher Aldine, who led brand development and who had, in Grayson's 18 days, said exactly 1 sentence to him directly, which was, the printer on 28 jams if you load more than 50 pages. Aldine's presentation was polished. The visuals were strong, the narrative framework was articulate, and the brand voice work was careful. It was genuinely good work in most respects. Grayson made 2 notes on his pad. He did not raise his hand. He was not planning to say anything. Sienna said, the brand voice framework, page 18. Read me the core tension statement. Aldine read it. Sienna said, that tension statement is identical in structure to the one we used on the Holloway account in 2022. The room was quiet. The language is different, Aldine said. The language is different. The architecture is the same. She looked at him steadily. Which means we're delivering a client a framework that we've already sold to someone in their competitive space. Aldine said, Holloway is in financial services. Meridian is consumer tech. There's no competitive overlap. The overlap is in the craft, Sienna said. We're supposed to bring Meridian something that's specifically theirs. If our core tension architecture is a template we're reapplying, we're not doing that. She paused. Go back to the brand research and rebuild the tension statement from the ground up, not from the template. Aldine's jaw tightened. This was 4 months of development. I know, she said. It's good work. It needs that one thing fixed. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. The review moved on to the 4th campaign, and then something happened that Grayson had not planned for. Marcus said, Grayson, you've been looking at the Horizon brief. Anything worth flagging before we close today? He looked up from his notepad. Every face in the room turned toward him. He was aware of Aldine's expression without looking directly at it. He said, There's a market positioning conflict in the current framework. Horizon and one of our other clients are targeting the same primary demographic with overlapping value propositions. If both campaigns run as currently designed, they undercut each other. Silence. Which other client? Marcus said. Grayson paused. I'd rather review that with you privately first. I want to make sure I'm reading the data correctly before I name names in a room. A few people exchanged glances. This was either very professional or very evasive, and Grayson was betting on professional. Sienna said, Talk to Marcus today. We'll address it in Thursday's review. Yes, Grayson said. She looked at him for a moment. That same quality of attention, measuring without judgment, processing without conclusion. Then she said, Anyone else? Nobody else spoke. The conflict he'd identified was real, and it was messy. And when he walked Marcus through it after the meeting, Marcus looked like a man who had just found a crack in a load-bearing wall. You're sure about this? Marcus said. The demographic overlap is about 60%, and the value proposition language in both briefs uses the same 3 differentiators. I've got the comparative analysis here. Marcus looked at it. He rubbed his hand over his jaw. How long has this been sitting there? At least 8 months, based on when the Horizon brief was drafted. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Does Sienna know you're bringing this Thursday? She said to bring it Thursday. That's not what I asked. Grayson looked at him. She knows I found something. She doesn't know the details yet. Marcus nodded slowly. He picked up the analysis and looked at it again. This is going to require some difficult client conversations. I know. One of these accounts is Thomas's. Grayson had figured that out. He hadn't said it out loud. He said it out loud now. I know. Marcus set the analysis down. He looked at Grayson with the specific expression of a man who was grateful for information he did not enjoy having. All right, he said. Thursday. He picked up Mia from school at 3:15 on Wednesday because her aftercare had a field trip conflict and he had rearranged his afternoon to make it work. She came out the front door of the school carrying a drawing she had made in art class. A house with a big tree, 4 figures standing in front of it, 2 tall and 2 small, the sun in the corner that all kids put in the corner. She thrust it at him immediately. I made this. The tall one is you, and the small one is me, and that's our building, and that's the tree on the corner. He looked at it. Who are the other 2? She had the specific expression of a 7-year-old who has said too much and is now recalibrating. Nobody, she said. They're just people. I needed 4 people to make the drawing balanced. He looked at the drawing for another moment. 2 tall figures, 2 small. The tree in the corner was lopsided and very large and somehow more convincing than the house. It's a great drawing, he said. I know, she said, with complete seriousness. Can we go to the park? We can go to the park. She took his hand and they walked, and she talked about fractions and cupcakes and a book she was reading and a disagreement she'd had with a girl named Petra that seemed to involve a disputed claim over who had invented a particular playground game. He listened to all of it. He asked questions in the right places. The park had a good bench near the fountain where the light came in at an angle that hit the water the right way in the afternoon, and he sat on it while Mia ran to the climbing structure, and for a few minutes he let himself just be still. He thought about the drawing with 4 figures. He thought about the tension statement on Aldine's presentation that Sienna had identified in the time it took most people to register the slide had changed. He thought about the email at 2:12 in the morning. Better. Present Monday. He looked at Mia climbing the structure with the specific fearlessness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of height, and something loosened in his chest that had been tightened for a long time. He didn't name it. He just let it be loose. She made it to the top and stood up there and looked down at him with her arms wide and her face triumphant, and he lifted his hand. She waved back. Thursday's review was tense in the specific way that corporate rooms get tense when accountability is on the table without a clear owner for the problem. He presented the conflict analysis. He walked it through cleanly, without theater, without emphasizing whose account was whose. The data was the data. The overlap was the overlap. Thomas said, "This is a methodology problem, not a strategy problem." Grayson said, "The outcome is the same either way. The origin matters." "Does it? To the clients?" Thomas looked at him with something that had moved past measuring into something harder. Sienna said, "Thomas, we need to separate the account's positioning. That's the action item. The origin conversation happens separately." She looked at Grayson. "Good analysis. Work with Harper on the client communications. I want a draft by Friday." "I'll have it Thursday night," he said. She held his gaze. "Thursday night works," she said. After the meeting in the hallway outside the conference room, Thomas stopped walking and turned to face him. "You've been here 3 weeks," Thomas said. 22 days, Grayson said. "You come in here with your back-of-napkin models, and you're—" Thomas stopped. Reset. "Some of us have been building these client relationships for years. You walk in and 2 of them are suddenly problems." "They were already problems," Grayson said. "I just found them." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "Be careful," he said. It wasn't quite a threat. It wasn't quite advice. It sat somewhere in between. "Thanks," Grayson said. Thomas walked away. Grayson stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back to his desk on 28 and opened his laptop and started on the client communication draft. He had it done by 8 that night. He sent it to Harper with a note, and he CC'd Marcus, and he drove home and made dinner and put Mia to bed and sat at his kitchen table in the quiet apartment with a glass of water and the city noise coming through the window. His phone buzzed. An email from Sienna. "Draft is good. 2 edits needed. I'll mark them up and send back tonight." He looked at his phone for a moment. Then he wrote back, "Thank you." He watched the screen for a minute, then another. 3 dots appeared. Then her reply. "Stop emailing me at 9 at night and go to sleep." Something that was not quite a laugh moved through him. He set his phone down. He looked at the city lights through the window. 22 days. He had survived. He had done more than survive, maybe. He wasn't sure yet. He was too close to tell. But the apartment didn't feel as quiet as it usually did, and he wasn't entirely sure why, and he decided not to think about it too hard tonight. He drank his water. He went to bed. The draft came back from Sienna at 11:40 that night with 2 comments inserted in the margins. Clean, specific, no excess explanation. One changed the framing of an apology to a client. The other tightened a liability statement that Grayson had written too broadly. Both edits were better than what he'd written. He made the changes and sent the final to Harper at midnight, and then sat in the dark kitchen, not quite ready to sleep, thinking about the fact that Sienna Vaughn had been working at 11:40 on a Thursday night and had thought it was reasonable to send markup at that hour, and also that she'd told him to go to sleep at 9, which meant she operated under a set of rules that did not apply to herself. He filed that away too. The client communications went out Friday morning. Walter Crane at Northbridge responded within 2 hours. Gracious, a little relieved, the tone of a man who'd known something was off and was glad someone had named it. The other client, whose account overlapped with Northbridge and who turned out to be a mid-size consumer tech company called Ardent, responded by the afternoon. Their response was less gracious. Harper spent most of Friday afternoon on the phone with them. Thomas did not speak to Grayson on Friday. Not in passing, not in the kitchen, not during the brief overlap they had near the printers at 10 in the morning. He looked at the space approximately 6 inches to Grayson's left and kept moving. Grayson let it be. The weekend was groceries and a broken kitchen faucet that dripped at 3-second intervals and kept him awake Saturday night until he got up at 2 and put a towel around the handle, which didn't fix it but muffled the sound enough. Sunday was the park again, and Mia's ongoing campaign to teach him a hand-clapping game she'd learned from Emma, which had 12 steps, and which he kept getting wrong at step 9 in a way that made her dissolve into laughter each time. He got it wrong on purpose twice. The third time he got it wrong because he actually couldn't get step 9 right, and she laughed anyway. And he laughed too, and the afternoon light was the particular gold that late October does in New York when it decides to be generous. He went back to Vaughn Media on Monday with the specific settled feeling of a man who knows what he's walking into. What he did not know was that in the 5 weeks since he'd started, something had shifted inside the building that he couldn't see from his position on 28. He understood this only gradually, the way you understand a current in water. Not by seeing it, but by noticing that you are moving in a direction you didn't choose. People started coming to him. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone announced. Camille asked him one Tuesday to look at a campaign brief she was developing and tell her if the demographic logic held. He read it, told her the logic held, but the emotional hook in the opening was doing too much work, and showed her where he meant. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "Yeah, okay, that's right," in the tone of someone mildly annoyed to be correct. James stopped by his desk Thursday to ask about the methodology he'd used on the Northbridge LTV model, not for any specific project, just curiosity about the approach. Even Derek, who was constitutionally oriented toward keeping things smooth and non-confrontational, started occasionally sending Grayson emails with questions that started with quick thought, and then contained something that was not quick at all. None of this was friendship exactly. It was something more practical than friendship, which in some ways Grayson respected more. Thomas remained the exception. He was professionally civil in rooms where Sienna or Marcus was present and pointedly absent from any interaction that didn't require him. Grayson noticed this the way he noticed a lot of things. Clearly, without urgency, tucking the information somewhere accessible. The thing that changed everything started with an invitation he wasn't expecting. It was a Wednesday, 6 weeks into his tenure, and he was working late, later than most of the floor, which had mostly cleared by 7. The cleaning crew was making its way through the kitchen. He had his laptop open and 3 windows going and a half-eaten sandwich to his left that had been better 2 hours ago. His phone buzzed. A calendar invite from Sienna's assistant. Thursday, 7 p.m., dinner meeting, address attached. Client pre-brief for Horizon launch. Dress appropriately. He looked at the address. It was a restaurant in the West Village that he recognized from the kind of press coverage it got. Not showy, not the places that tried to be seen, the quieter, expensive kind. He looked at the invite for a moment, then he accepted it and went back to his laptop. Dress appropriately. He didn't own a suit that was better than the one he wore to the office. He went home, took the suit out, and pressed it again carefully, and this time the collar came out right on the first pass. The restaurant was small and warm and smelled like garlic and wood smoke. The Horizon client was a man named Davis Park, late 40s, co-founder of a consumer health company that had started as a startup 8 years ago and had grown into something serious, the kind of company that now needed to think about brand architecture the way it hadn't had to when it was just 2 people and an idea. He had a director of marketing with him, a woman named Lena, who was sharp and asked good questions, and who Grayson could tell had been skeptical about this agency relationship from the beginning. Sienna was already at the table when Grayson arrived. She was wearing something dark and simple that cost more than his monthly rent, and she was drinking water, and she was in conversation with Davis Park in the easy way of 2 people who had met before. She looked up when he came in and said, "Grayson, Davis, this is Grayson Hale. He's leading strategy on your account." Davis Park shook his hand with the warm directness of someone who had spent years having to be immediately readable to people. "Sienna tells me you rebuilt our brief from scratch." "I rebuilt the approach," Grayson said. "The brief had good bones." "Diplomatic," Davis Park said, with a smile that said he knew the bones had not been good. Dinner lasted 2 hours. It was not primarily about the campaign. It was the kind of conversation that has to happen before the real work can, where a client decides whether the people across the table are actually thinking about their problem or just thinking about the deliverable. Grayson talked about the market research, the demographic shift he'd identified, the narrative framework. He talked about what wasn't going to work and why, which made Lena sit forward slightly because people in agency relationships did not usually say that. He asked Davis Park questions about where he wanted the company to be in 3 years. Not 2. 3, because 2-year thinking had a different shape than 3-year thinking, and he wanted to understand the shape. Davis Park answered the 3-year question thoughtfully and at length, and somewhere in the middle of his answer, Grayson felt Sienna, who was seated across from him, look at him. Not at Davis, at him. For just a moment before she looked back at the client. By the end of the evening, Davis Park was relaxed in the way people get when they've decided to trust something. Lena was not relaxed exactly, but had shifted from skeptical to engaged, which was better. They said goodnight outside the restaurant. When the car pulled away, Grayson and Sienna were briefly on the sidewalk together. Good dinner, she said. Davis is smart. He is. Lena's smarter. She looked up the street. The West Village was doing what it does on October nights. The old buildings and the leaf-scattered sidewalks and the light from the restaurant windows. You did well in there. You barely said anything in the second half, he said. I didn't need to. She said it simply, not as a compliment to him, just as a fact about the room. He looked at her. She was looking at her phone, reading something. The restaurant light caught the side of her face. Can I ask you something? He said. She glanced up. Probably. Why'd you bring me to this one? You've handled client dinners yourself for how long? You don't need someone to run point. She was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable. She didn't do uncomfortable, or not in any way that showed, but thinking. The Horizon account is going to be a 2-year relationship if we do it right, she said. Davis needs to know the person who's actually doing the work, not just the person who signs the proposals. She put her phone in her bag. I won't be in every room for the next 2 years. That's a practical answer, he said. It's the true one. A car moved past. She looked down the street for her car service. What other kind were you expecting? He didn't answer that. She glanced at him, and there was something in the look that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it, something that moved through her expression and was gone before he could be sure he'd seen it correctly. Her car arrived. She got in. The door closed and the car moved into traffic, and Grayson stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to the subway. The file was in a storage archive on the company's internal server, buried under 3 layers of folder organization that bore the specific quality of something organized to be inaccessible rather than organized to be found. Grayson found it because he was looking for something else entirely. He had been working late on a Wednesday in his 7th week, running comparative analysis on the Horizon account's competitor landscape, and he'd gone into the shared research archive looking for a market study from 2019 that Priya had mentioned in passing 2 weeks earlier. The archive was organized by year and then by project code, and the 2019 folder was large and not well maintained. He found the market study. He also found a subfolder labeled VMG, Internal Review, 2019-R, that had no project name attached to it, just the code, which was not unusual. Internal review folders were common, but this one had a modification date that was recent, not 2019, 14 months ago. 14 months. Someone had accessed and modified a 2019 folder 14 months ago and not renamed it or moved it. He opened it. The folder contained 31 documents. Most were financial documents, ledgers, transaction records, what looked like audit trail logs. The language was corporate and dry, and some of it was technical enough that he couldn't immediately parse all of it. But one document was different. It was a memo, internal, dated July 2019, and the subject line was Structural Review, Vaughn Capital Holdings, Concerns, Account Transfers. He read it. Then he read it again. The memo was written by a man named Edmund Vaughn. He was identifying what he described as a pattern of irregular account transfers within a holding company, transfers that moved significant amounts of capital in ways that were structurally designed to avoid standard reporting thresholds. The memo was addressed to a board committee that no longer appeared in any current company documentation Grayson had ever seen. Edmund Vaughn. He sat back in his chair. He knew that name. Everyone at Vaughn Media knew that name. The way you know a name that exists in the company's history, the way a stone exists in the foundation. Present, structural, never discussed. Edmund Vaughn had been the company's founder, Sienna's father. He had died in 2019. The company's official history described it as a sudden illness. The framing had always been quiet enough that Grayson had never thought to question it. He stared at the document. The memo was dated 3 months before Edmund Vaughn died. He closed the folder. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface for about a minute, not moving. The floor was empty around him. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The city hummed quietly through the windows. He thought about the modification date 14 months ago. Someone had gone into this archive and opened these files relatively recently. The modification timestamp could mean any number of things. A system migration, an automated backup, someone running a search that had accidentally touched the metadata. Or it meant someone had been in here 14 months ago looking at these same documents. He needed to think carefully before he did anything. He closed his laptop and went home. Plus, he didn't sleep well. Not because he was panicking. He wasn't, or he was managing it, but because his mind kept turning the memo over the way you turn a stone over to look at what's underneath. Edmund Vaughn had found something and written a memo about it, and 3 months later he was dead, and that sequence lived in Grayson's mind with a weight he didn't know how to put down. In the morning, he made Mia's oatmeal and let her have the chocolate chips without being asked, and drove her to school, and then sat in the car for a few minutes in the school drop-off lane after she'd gone inside, the engine running, the radio off. He had two choices. He could put the folder in the back of his mind and leave it there and focus on doing his job, or he could look at it more carefully. The second option was going to require telling Sienna. Eventually, he knew that. Whatever was in those documents, they involved her father, which meant they involved her, which meant he wasn't going to be able to handle this on his own without it becoming something he was doing behind her back. That felt wrong in a way he couldn't rationalize away, but he also didn't know what he had yet. He had a memo and a modification date and a sequence of events that could mean a dozen different things. He needed to understand it better before he walked into Sienna Vaughn's office and said something that couldn't be unsaid. He drove to Vaughn Media. He spent the next 4 days going through the documents in the folder in small increments, in the early mornings before the floor filled up, and in the late evenings after it cleared. He was not taking anything out of the system. He was not copying anything. He was reading. What he found, slowly, was the shape of something. The irregular transfers identified in Edmund Vaughn's memo had a pattern. They moved capital from subsidiary accounts into a holding structure that was, as far as Grayson could tell from the documents, which were incomplete, controlled by a small number of individuals. The memo named 3 entities, but not the individuals behind them. The transaction logs showed the transfers continuing over a period of roughly 2 years before Edmund Vaughn had apparently identified them. There were also emails, 4 of them, embedded in a compressed file inside the folder. He almost missed them. The emails were between Edmund Vaughn and a lawyer, fragmentary, cautious, the language of someone trying to be careful about what he committed to writing. But the shape of what Edmund had found was clear enough. He believed money was being systematically extracted from his company through structures that were designed to be invisible. He had died before he could do anything about it. Grayson sat with that for a long time. On Friday of that week, he was in the kitchen getting coffee at 7:15 when Sienna walked in. This was unusual. She rarely came to 28, and 7:15 was early even by her standards. She was in her coat, which meant she had just arrived, and she looked like a person who had not slept enough. She poured coffee without looking at him and said, without preamble, "The Ardent situation is escalating. They're threatening to pull the contract." "I saw Harper's email last night," he said. "I need a counterproposal by Monday. Something that gives them a genuine reason to stay that isn't just a price concession." She drank her coffee. She looked tired in the specific way that didn't make her seem diminished, just more human. The sharpness was still there, just running on less than its usual reserve. He said, "I can have something Friday afternoon." She looked at him. "You're in the middle of Horizon Prep." "I can do both." She was quiet for a moment, studying him in that direct way she had. The Ardent account was Thomas's. "I know. He's not going to appreciate you coming in on it." "That's going to be a recurring theme," Grayson said. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Not amusement, something more complicated. "You're not worried about it." "I'm a little worried about it," he said. "I'm more worried about losing the account." She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once and took her coffee and left. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after she was gone. He needed to tell her about the folder. He knew he needed to, but the timing was wrong and his evidence was incomplete, and he was still working out what he was actually looking at. He'd give himself until he had something solid. Then he'd tell her. He went back to his desk. The Ardent counterproposal took him until 2 a.m. Friday. He sent it to Sienna directly, not through Harper, not through Marcus, because it needed a decision-maker's eyes before it went anywhere else. And he went to bed and slept hard and woke up at 7 to Mia standing at his bedroom door in her pajamas holding a book. "It's Saturday," she announced. "I know. You slept in." "I worked late." She came in and climbed onto the bed next to him with her book, which was a chapter book about a girl who could talk to horses, and she read quietly for 20 minutes while he lay there coming awake slowly, the particular domestic peace of a Saturday morning settling over the apartment. At some point, she said, without looking up from her book, "Are you happy at your new job?" He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." She turned a page. "You seem different." "Different how?" She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to genuine questions. "Like you're not pretending as much," she said. He looked at the ceiling. 7 years old. He had no idea how she did it. "That's probably a good thing," he said. "It is," she said confidently, and turned another page. Sienna's response to the Ardent proposal arrived at 8:47 Saturday morning. "This is the right approach. 2 adjustments. I'll call you at 10. She called at 10:03. He was in the grocery store. He stood in the cereal aisle and they talked for 22 minutes about the counterproposal, the adjustments she wanted, the client psychology they were navigating. She was clear and precise and moved through the conversation quickly. At the end, she said, "Have you eaten breakfast?" He looked at the cereal boxes around him. "I'm in the grocery store." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "Not yet." "Eat something." She hung up. He stood in the cereal aisle for a moment, phone in hand. Then he put a box of Mia's preferred cereal, the one with the marshmallows, which he had opinions about but had stopped fighting, in the cart and kept shopping. He told her on a Tuesday in his 9th week, not in her office, not in a scheduled meeting. He caught her in the hallway outside the 34th floor conference room after an external presentation had run long and the building was mostly still occupied, but the specific stretch of hallway was empty for a moment. He said, "I need to show you something. Not here, and not in a meeting room where someone can walk in." She looked at him. The presentation had gone well. She was still in that mode, focused and forward-moving. And he watched her shift gears, read his face, register that this was something different. "My office," she said. 20 minutes. Her office was at the end of 34 corner, 2 walls of glass looking out at the city. It was spare, almost nothing personal in it, which he'd noticed the one other time he'd been in it. One photograph on this credenza behind her desk, small, a man and a younger woman, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of a building he didn't recognize. He put the printed documents on her desk. He didn't want to do this on a screen. He wanted her to be able to hold the pages. She looked at the first page. Then she looked up at him. "Where did you find this?" He told her. The archive, the search, the modification date, all of it. He told her in the order he'd found things, because the order mattered. It showed her that he hadn't gone looking for this, and that he hadn't been sitting on it longer than he had been. She didn't speak while he talked. She looked at the pages, turning them slowly, reading carefully. When she got to the 4th email, she went very still. He waited. She read it again. Her face was doing something complex and controlled, the kind of controlled that costs something, the kind that has a history behind it. When she finally spoke, her voice was even. "He wrote this 4 months before he died." "I know." "He found it. He was going to—" She stopped. She set the page down carefully, like it was fragile. "We were told it was his heart, that it was sudden." She looked at Grayson. Her eyes were clear and direct, and there was something in them that he had not seen before, something that had been underneath the precision and the authority and the deliberate distance all along, something old and unresolved. "He was in perfect health." Grayson said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the city for a long time. He stayed where he was, the documents on her desk between them, the photograph on the credenza behind her. "The modification date," she said, without turning around. 14 months ago. Yes. Someone accessed these files 14 months ago. That's what the metadata shows. She was quiet. 14 months ago was when I promoted Raymond Stahl to COO. Grayson went still. Raymond Stahl had been at Vaughn Media for 11 years. He was 53, steady, careful, the kind of executive who accumulated trust over time by never doing anything dramatically wrong. He ran operations with a thoroughness that most people read as loyalty. You think he accessed them, Grayson said. I think someone who knew these files existed accessed them 14 months ago. She turned from the window. Her face had reorganized itself into something careful, something that was processing rather than feeling, or rather processing as feeling. I think someone needed to know if they were still buried. She looked at Grayson. He looked back at her. I'm not going to pretend I know what happened to my father, she said. I don't have proof of anything beyond what's in those documents, but I have been running this company for 4 years, and I have been looking without knowing what I was looking for, without knowing it was looking, and now. She stopped. She looked at the documents on her desk. Now I have something. Grayson said carefully, we need to be certain before we move on this. If Stahl is involved and we tip our hand, I know, she said. I know that. She looked at him. I'm not going to do anything impulsive. He believed her, which was interesting because most of what he'd seen from Sienna Vaughn in the previous 9 weeks had suggested that she moved fast and moved precisely and rarely second-guessed herself. But there was something in her now that was different from that, something more interior and more careful, something that had been waiting for a long time and knew how to wait. I need to think, she said. I know. I need a day. Take it. She looked at him for a moment. The city behind her was doing the late afternoon light, the angled gold of it coming through the glass. She looked, just briefly, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told that someone else could see it. Why did you come to me with this? She said. You could have taken it to Marcus. He thought about that for a moment. Because he was your father, he said. She held his gaze. Something in it shifted, not softened, that wasn't the right word, but opened slightly, like a window being raised a crack to let something through. She looked down at the documents. Leave these with me, she said. He left them. He walked out of her office, down the hallway to the elevator, and he stood in the elevator on the way down and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from having done something that mattered, and not being able to yet know whether it would matter in the right direction. He picked up Mia at 5:40. She asked him about his day. He said it was a long one. She said long days required pancakes for dinner, and she made this argument so comprehensively that he agreed, and they had pancakes. And she ate 4 small ones and fell asleep during the 2nd chapter of her horse book. And he sat at the kitchen table afterward in the quiet and didn't look at his phone. He let the night be quiet. He thought it might be a while before things were quiet again. Sienna came back to him the next afternoon with a legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting and a look on her face that he was beginning to recognize. Not the boardroom face, not the client dinner face, but the one underneath both of those, the one that meant she had been thinking hard about something difficult and had arrived at a position she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but was going to hold anyway. She came to 28, which she almost never did. She stood at the edge of his desk and said quietly, "Walk with me." They took the stairs to 32, which had a small conference room at the end of a corridor that was mostly used for storage overflow. Boxes of old marketing materials, a broken standing desk folded against the wall, a table with 4 chairs and a window that faced the building next door. Nobody used it for actual meetings, which was presumably the point. She closed the door. She sat down. He sat across from her. I've been thinking about Stahl, she said. Okay. He's been here 11 years. He runs operations. He has access to financial systems, security infrastructure, vendor contracts, essentially everything that keeps the company running day to day. She looked at her legal pad. If he knew those documents existed, and if he accessed them 14 months ago to confirm they were still buried, then he's been operating with the knowledge that there's a liability sitting in this company's archive for over a year. Which means he's probably taken precautions, Grayson said. Yes. She looked up. We can't go at this directly. If he suspects we've found the documents, he moves whatever he needs to move and we lose it all, whatever it all turns out to be. Grayson had been thinking about the same problem for 2 days. We need more than the documents. The documents show that your father found something. They don't prove what happened to him, and they don't prove Stahl's involvement, just the access timestamp. Right. She turned a page on the legal pad. So we need to trace the money. The transfers your father identified. They went into holding structures. If we can map those structures to current entities, we can establish whether they're still active, whether value was extracted, and who benefited. That requires a forensic financial review. Yes. Which we can't commission internally without it getting back to Stahl through the operations systems he controls. Yes, she said again. He leaned back in his chair. So we need someone outside the company. I have a name, a forensic accounting firm my father used for external audits before. She stopped. Reset. Before. They're independent, they're discreet, and they owe me nothing, which means they're not compromised. She wrote something on the pad. I'll reach out privately, not through company channels. That's going to cost money that doesn't appear in a company expense account. I know. I'll handle it personally. He looked at her. She said it the way she said a lot of things, factually, without asking for acknowledgement. This is the reality. I'll manage it. He had noticed in the weeks since he'd known her that she had a strong reflex towards self-sufficiency that occasionally crossed into something harder than self-sufficiency, something more like preemptive isolation. She dealt with problems by absorbing them. There was a version of that quality that was strength and a version that was damage, and they looked almost identical from the outside. He said, I can help with the financial mapping. I'm not a forensic accountant, but I understand the structures your father identified, and if you bring in the firm, I can work as an interface, review their findings, translate them into what we actually need for evidence. She looked at him for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. This isn't part of your job. I know that too. She held his gaze. Then she wrote something else on her legal pad and said, I'll set up the call with the firm for next week. Keep working your accounts normally. Don't change anything in your behavior around Stahl. He nodded. And Grayson. She looked up. Nobody else knows about this. Not Marcus. He understood why. Marcus was good and loyal and had been with the company for years, but Marcus was also embedded in the company's operational structure in ways that Stahl could touch. The fewer people who knew, the fewer points of exposure. Nobody else, he said, but the difficulty of keeping a secret inside a building where you spent 50 hours a week was that it required you to behave normally while carrying something that changed the quality of every interaction. Grayson had not appreciated this fully until he was doing it. He worked his accounts. He delivered the ardent counterproposal in a meeting that went better than expected. The client was still wary, but the proposal gave them a genuine reason to stay, and they stayed. He continued developing the Horizon strategy, which was now in a strong place, the campaign framework solid, and the client relationship with Davis Park healthing into something productive. He had 2 new accounts come across his desk in his 10th week, small ones, handed to him by Marcus, with a brevity that suggested they were a test of capacity rather than a gift. He managed all of it. He was good at his job and he knew it, and he did not need to be reminded of it, which meant he could carry it without it showing. Thomas remained in his peripheral vision, professionally functional, personally distant. In a Thursday review meeting in Grayson's 10th week, Thomas made a comment about the Northbridge timeline that was technically about the account and structurally about Grayson. The kind of comment that lands in a room and has 2 meanings, and everyone in the room understands both. Marcus let it pass. Sienna, who was at the far end of the table reviewing something on her laptop, did not look up but said, "The Northbridge timeline is where it needs to be," in a tone that closed the comment without drama, the way you close a door quietly rather than slam it. Thomas said nothing after that. Grayson wrote a note on his pad and kept his expression neutral. After the meeting, in the hallway, Sienna fell into step beside him for about 30 seconds, the length of the hallway between the conference room and the elevator bank. She said without looking at him, "Thomas is going to be a problem." "He already is," Grayson said. "I mean, a larger one." She pressed the elevator button. "He's been managing the Stahl relationship for most of his time here. If Stahl is nervous, He'll be watching his exposure points, and Thomas is one of them. Grayson absorbed that. Are you saying Thomas might know something? I'm saying Thomas has been very useful to very powerful people in this company for a long time, and that kind of usefulness has a cost. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. Watch what you say around him. The doors closed. Grayson stood in the hallway for a moment, turning that over. He had been watching what he said around Thomas for weeks. He would watch more carefully now. Well, the forensic accounting firm's name was Bellevue Analytics, and Sienna's call with them happened on a Friday that Grayson was not on. He found out about it Monday when she forwarded him a brief summary. 4 sentences, nothing identifying, the kind of summary you send through personal email rather than company systems. The firm had agreed to take it on. They would need 8 to 12 weeks for a thorough review. Preliminary findings in 4 weeks. Grayson counted forward. That put them at the company's annual shareholder conference, which was in mid-January, which was 6 weeks out. The timing was uncomfortable. The shareholder conference was the highest visibility moment in Vaughn Media's calendar, a 2-day event with presentations and dinners and the specific energy of institutional performance. He wrote back to Sienna's personal email. Timeline puts preliminary findings the week of the shareholder conference. We should plan for that contingency. Her reply came within the hour. Already noted, working on it. He had no doubt that she was. The first time Mia met Sienna was an accident, which was the only way it could have happened without Grayson overthinking it into impossibility. It was a Saturday in late November, cold and bright, the kind of Saturday that New York occasionally produces in the weeks before winter fully commits. The sky a hard, clean blue, and the air sharp enough to register. Grayson was taking Mia to the Chelsea market because she had seen a video online of the fish market and had decided she needed to see a real fish market with her own eyes, a conviction she held with the specific intensity of a child who has recently discovered the existence of a thing and cannot rest until she has verified it personally. They were coming out of the market's main entrance, Mia holding a paper bag that contained a small smoked salmon that she had selected herself through an extended negotiation process with the vendor, when Grayson nearly walked into Sienna Vaughn on the sidewalk. She was in a dark coat and carrying a canvas bag and looked, for the first fraction of a second before she registered who she'd almost collided with, like a person who was somewhere private in their head, focused inward, not paying attention to the sidewalk foot traffic the way New Yorkers stop paying attention to it after long enough. Then she saw him, and her expression shifted back to its usual assembled state. "Hail," she said. "Hi," he said. She looked down at Mia, who was looking up at her with the direct, fearless appraisal of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude and has formed the view that it isn't anyway. "This is Mia," Grayson said. "I know who she is," Sienna said, to Mia. "He talks about you." Mia's eyebrows went up. "What does he say?" "That you're the reason he learned to make oatmeal." Mia considered this. "That's true. He used to make it wrong." She held up the paper bag. "We got a fish. I picked it. Do you like fish?" Sienna looked at the bag. "Yes." "It's smoked," Mia said. "The man explained the whole thing. Smoking is how they preserve it. Did you know that?" "I did know that." "My dad didn't." Mia looked up at Grayson. "He didn't know." "I knew the general concept," Grayson said. Mia turned back to Sienna with the expression of someone who has evidence and is deploying it. "He didn't know." Then seamlessly, "Are you coming to get food?" Sienna glanced at Grayson. He gave her nothing. He was curious how she was going to handle a 7-year-old who had decided to include her in the morning without asking. "I was going to get coffee," Sienna said. "We were going to get hot chocolate," Mia said. "That's like coffee but better. You could come." Grayson said, "Mia, it's fine," Sienna said. It came out slightly like she'd surprised herself, the fraction of a second delay before the words that suggested she'd decided something she hadn't planned to decide. They got hot chocolate and coffee at a place inside the market, a small counter with stools, the kind of place that doesn't try to be anything. Mia sat between them, which she had engineered by claiming the middle stool while they were still deciding whether to stay. And she talked about the fish and fractions and a girl named Emma and a book about horses, the same things she always talked about, in the particular unguarded way of a child who has not yet learned to edit herself for an audience. Sienna asked questions, real ones, not the performed questions adults ask children, not, "And what grade are you in?" and "What's your favorite subject?" but actual follow-up questions to what Mia was actually saying. When Mia said the horse book had a part that was sad, Sienna asked what made it sad. When Mia said the girl in the book had to leave her horse behind when her family moved, Sienna was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a real kind of sad, not a made-up kind." Mia looked at her very seriously. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." Grayson watched this happen. He drank his coffee and watched his daughter and his CEO have a conversation about a horse book on a Saturday morning in November, and something moved through him that he didn't examine too closely. When they left, Mia took Sienna's hand for about half a block, spontaneously, without asking, the way she sometimes took the hand of adults she had decided she liked, a gesture so natural she probably didn't register doing it. Sienna looked down at Mia's hand in hers with an expression that was harder to read than anything Grayson had seen on her face in a boardroom or a client dinner or a 30-second hallway conversation. Something careful and slightly undone, like a room where someone has moved all the furniture 2 inches from where it used to be. Everything in the right place, but nothing quite where the body expects it. They said goodbye on the corner. Mia waved. Sienna walked half a block, stopped, turned, and waved back. Grayson did not say anything about it in the car ride home. Mia put on her seatbelt and looked out the window and said, "She's different than I thought." "How did you think she'd be?" "I don't know. Scary, maybe. That's how you talk about her." He frowned. "I don't talk about her like she's scary." Mia gave him a look. "Dad," she said, in the tone that meant, "We both know the truth here." He drove. The city moved past the windows, and after a while Mia opened her book and read, and he was left alone with whatever the morning had just done to him. 3 weeks after the Chelsea market morning, the thing he'd been careful to keep from happening happened anyway. He was at his desk on a Tuesday when his access credentials stopped working for the second time since he joined the company. He called IT. They told him there was a security review underway and his access had been flagged for re-verification, which was a standard process. He waited. He worked on paper. At 3 in the afternoon, Marcus appeared at his desk with an expression that Grayson recognized immediately as the expression of a man delivering news he didn't want to be delivering. "Walk with me," Marcus said. They went to the small conference room on 32, the same room where Grayson and Sienna had mapped out their approach to stall. Grayson stood on the far side of the table. Marcus closed the door and turned to face him with his hands loose at his sides, the body language of someone trying to signal that he was not the author of what he was about to say. "There's been a financial discrepancy flagged in the company accounts," Marcus said, "specifically in the Northbridge and Horizon account expense tracking." Grayson went very still. "The amounts are significant," Marcus said. "The internal audit team identified transfers that, on the surface, route through expense codes tied to your accounts." He kept his voice level. "I haven't made any unusual expenses on those accounts." "I know that," Marcus said, and the way he said it told Grayson that Marcus believed him and also that believing him wasn't going to be sufficient. "But the documentation exists. Transfers with your employee ID in the authorization trail." "That's not possible. I don't have authorization-level access to fund transfers." "Someone does," Marcus said quietly, "and someone put your ID in the trail." The room was very quiet for a moment. Grayson understood what was happening. He understood it completely and immediately, the way you understand something when you've been watching for it long enough. Not surprise, but the cold confirmation of a thing you knew was coming and hoped was wrong. He thought about the 14-month-old access timestamp on Edmund Vaughn's documents. He thought about Thomas in the hallway. "Be careful." He thought about Stahlsig, 53 years old, 11 years at the company, the man who ran operations and financial systems and security infrastructure and essentially everything that kept the company running day to day. "The board has called an emergency meeting," Marcus said. "Tomorrow morning. You need to be there." "Sienna knows?" Marcus looked at him with something that was close to pain. "Sienna called the meeting." He sat with that for a moment. The room was cold with the building's air conditioning and the specific cold of a situation that was moving in one direction regardless of what he wanted. "Marcus," he said. "I didn't do this." "I know," Marcus said again. "Whatever the documentation shows, it was put there." "Grayson?" Marcus stopped. He looked at the table, at the wall, back at Grayson. He was a decent man caught between what he believed and what the institutional momentum required him to do. "I believe you. I want you to know that. But I am not the only person in that room tomorrow." The board meeting was at 9. There were 12 people in the room, the full board plus 2 external auditors who had been brought in overnight, which meant this had been in motion for at least 48 hours before Marcus told him. Sienna was at the head of the table. She had the particular quality of stillness she wore when she was containing something large, and she did not look at Grayson when he entered, which told him more than looking at him would have. The lead auditor, a woman named Gail, mid-50s, the affect of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it has become procedure, walked through the findings in 22 minutes. 3 irregular transfers. Total amount, $2.3 million, all routed through expense authorizations that bore Grayson's employee ID. The authorization timestamps placed them at times when Grayson had been in the building, which he recognized was deliberate. Someone who understood the security logs had used times when his badge had already recorded his presence. He listened to all of it without speaking. When Gail finished, the board member who spoke first was a man named Preston, mid-60s, institutional money, the kind of board member who had been on enough boards to have a practiced look of grave deliberation that he deployed regardless of how much deliberation had actually happened. "Mr. Hale," Preston said, "do you have anything to say to these findings?" "Yes," Grayson said. "I didn't do it." The room was quiet. "The documentation shows," Preston began. "I know what the documentation shows," Grayson said. "I'm telling you it was fabricated. I don't have transfer authorization access. The fact that my ID appears in the authorization trail means someone with access to the identity management system put it there." "That's a significant claim," Preston said. "It's the only explanation for what you're describing." "Or you found a way to circumvent—" "I've been here 11 weeks, Grayson said. "I'm a creative strategist. I don't have system administration access, and I've never requested it." He looked at Preston steadily. "Someone built this and placed it carefully and did it well enough to pass a first look. That takes time, and it takes access, and it takes a reason." He paused. "I would like to know when this investigation started and who initiated it." A different kind of silence in the room now. Sienna spoke for the first time. Her voice was flat and absolutely controlled. "The investigation was initiated by an internal security flag triggered 6 days ago. The flag originated in the operations monitoring system." Operations. Stall. Grayson looked at her. He was looking for something in her face. Some signal, some acknowledgement, some indication that she was holding the same understanding he was, and he found nothing. She was locked down completely. He didn't know if that was because she believed what was in the documents or because she didn't and couldn't show it. He didn't know which one was worse. "The board's recommendation," Preston said, "given the active investigation, is to suspend Mr. Hale pending the completion of the audit. With pay," he added, as though that made it better. Grayson looked around the table. Marcus was staring at the surface in front of him. The 2 external board members had the careful, neutral expressions of people following institutional protocol. The internal board members were a mix of discomfort and resolution. And Sienna. Sienna said, "Agreed." Her voice did not waver. "The suspension is effective today." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and for one moment, one fraction of a moment, something moved through her eyes that was not the boardroom face, and was not the controlled processing face, and was not anything he had a name for except that it was real. Whatever it was real, and it was difficult, and it was the face of a person making a decision that cost them something. Then it was gone. "You'll need to surrender your badge," Marcus said quietly. Grayson stood up. He took the badge from his pocket and set it on the table. He did not slam it, and he did not place it delicately. He set it down the way you set down a thing that is not the point, that has never been the point. He walked out of the room without saying anything else. The ride home was the Q train to Queens, which he took because it was what he knew, and he sat in the plastic seat with his coat in his lap and the underground tunnels moving past the windows and the particular numbness of a person in the aftermath of something they'd half expected but had hoped was wrong. He got home at 11:30. The apartment was empty and quiet. Mia was at school. He sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything. Then he called the school and told them he'd be picking Mia up himself today. Then he made coffee. Then he sat at the table with the coffee and thought through what he knew with the careful, methodical honesty that had always been his version of coping. Not looking away from hard things, just looking at them until they had a shape. He had been framed. That was the fact. The framing was good enough to survive a first audit, which meant it had been built with genuine knowledge of the company's financial systems, which meant Stahl had almost certainly built it himself or directed someone who had. The timing, 6 days ago, put the trigger somewhere around the time Sienna had contacted Bellevue Analytics, which meant Stahl either had visibility into Sienna's personal communications or had simply been watching for signs of movement and had seen one. The evidence he and Sienna had accumulated pointed at Stahl, but from the outside, from the board's position, from the audit's position, the evidence on the table pointed at Grayson. He picked Mia up at 3:15. She came out the front door and ran at him, arms out, and he caught her. "You're early," she said. "I am." "Did something happen?" He held her for a moment before setting her down. Her brown eyes were very direct, looking at him with that uncanny perception of hers. He had never been able to lie to her effectively, and he had stopped trying. He had also learned to calibrate how much truth a 7-year-old needed. "I'm taking a little break from work," he said. "You got fired?" "Suspended." "It's different." She considered this seriously. "Is it your fault?" "No." "Then it'll be okay," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has not yet accumulated enough disappointments to doubt that statement, and he almost couldn't stand how much he wanted her to be right. They walked home. She held his hand. She told him about fractions and Emma and the horse book, and he listened to all of it, and the afternoon light on the Queens sidewalks was gray and cold, but the warmth of her hand was very specific and very real. At home she had homework, and he made dinner, and after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and checked his personal email. There was one email, from Sienna's personal account, not her company address. No subject line. The body said 4 words. "I know it wasn't you." He read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. Then he typed back. "Then find it." He closed his laptop. He looked at the dark window and the city lights beyond it and the cold November night, and he thought about Mia's drawing with 4 figures in front of a house with a lopsided tree, and he thought about a 7-year-old's hand in a woman's hand for half a block on a Saturday morning, and he thought about a photograph on a credenza, a man and a young woman standing in front of a building, a father and a daughter, before everything went wrong. He thought about all of it, then he went to bed. The days after the suspension had a specific texture that Grayson had not anticipated, not the sharp, acute misery of a crisis, but something duller and more corrosive, the particular grinding quality of waiting while your reputation sits in a room you're not allowed to enter. He did what he could do. He made breakfast. He took Mia to school. He came back to the apartment and worked, not for Vaughn Media, which he could no longer access, but on his own analysis, pulling everything he documented in the weeks since finding Edmund Vaughn's files, organizing it into a structure that could be understood by someone who hadn't been inside his head for the past 2 months. He built a timeline on paper, real paper, taped to the wall of the second bedroom that was technically Mia's, but that she used primarily for art projects and the occasional blanket fort, the walls already covered in her drawings. He put his timeline between a crayon horse and a drawing of their building, and every morning he stood in front of it for 20 minutes with his coffee and looked at the shape of what he knew. The shape was not yet complete. It had the outline of something real, but the interior was still full of inference and probability and gaps that needed to be filled by Bellevue Analytics, or by luck, or by something he hadn't thought of yet. Sienna did not call him. She emailed twice, from her personal account, brief and careful, updates without details. The communication of someone operating under surveillance they couldn't fully map. The first email said the Bellevue review was continuing, and they expected preliminary findings within the week. The The second said the board had extended the audit timeline, and Preston was pushing for a resolution before the shareholder conference, which was now 4 weeks away. 4 weeks. He wrote back both times. Short replies. He did not ask how she was doing because he sensed that was not a question she had space for right now, and also because he knew she wouldn't answer it honestly, not in an email, not in these circumstances. He had not told her what he was working on in the apartment. He would tell her when it was something. Mia found the file on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of his suspension. He had been using his laptop on the kitchen table, cross-referencing the transaction records he'd printed from the archived folder before everything locked down against the corporate structure documents that were part of Vaughn Media's public filings. He had printed a lot of documents. They were organized in labeled folders in a cardboard box that lived on the kitchen table because the apartment did not have a study, just 2 bedrooms and a living room with a kitchen attached, the specific geography of a life built around practical constraints. Mia had come home from school at 3:15, done her homework with the focused efficiency of a child who understands that homework is the price of screen time, and then wandered into the kitchen looking for a snack. He was on a phone call, his former colleague from Mercer Creative, a woman named Dana who had connections in corporate financial journalism, and who he was carefully, obliquely, asking about the public record around Vaughn Capital Holdings circa 2018 and 2019. He stepped onto the small balcony to take the call. 3 minutes, maybe 4. When he came back inside, Mia was sitting at the kitchen table with one of his printed documents in her hands. His first instinct was to take it from her, and he was halfway across the kitchen before he stopped. She was looking at it with the serious, focused expression she used for things that genuinely interested her. The same expression she used for the horse book, the same expression she'd had when the fish vendor at Chelsea Market explained smoking. She was tracing something on the page with her finger. "Mia, that's Dad," she said. She didn't look up. "These circles, they keep coming back." He came around the table and looked over her shoulder. She had found one of the transaction record documents, a ledger printout from 2018 showing the irregular transfers Edmund Vaughn had identified. Grayson had been working through it that morning, tracking the routing numbers. Mia was looking at the columns of numbers the way she looked at math problems, not as an accountant would, but as a child who had spent 2 years doing puzzles with her father would, looking for the pattern in the shape of the thing. "What circles?" he said. "These numbers keep going in circles." She put her finger on a routing code in the left column, then moved it across the page to an account number in the right column, then flipped to the next page. She'd already been through multiple pages, he realized, without him noticing, and found the same routing code appearing as a destination. It goes here, and then it goes here, and then it comes back to here, like a circle. Why does it do that? He went very still. She was right. He had been tracking the transfers linearly, following the money forward, tracing its destination. He had not followed it back around. He had not considered that the structure might be circular, a routing architecture designed to obscure the origin by cycling funds through intermediary accounts before returning them to a point close enough to the source that the net movement was essentially zero in the visible ledgers, while the actual extraction happened in the margins of each cycle. It was an old technique. It was the kind of thing that looked like normal account activity if you were looking at any individual transaction and only became visible if you mapped the complete cycle. A 7-year-old had seen it in 4 minutes because she was looking at the shape rather than the content. "Mia," he said, "can you show me exactly where you saw it start?" She did. She walked him through it with her finger, patient and precise, the way she walked him through step 9 of the hand-clapping game. He followed her logic. She was correct. The cycle was there, and it ran through 7 accounts over a period of approximately 8 months before the final extraction point, which was a holding entity he had not been able to identify from the other documents, but which now, with the circular structure mapped, he could potentially trace backward. He sat down across from her and looked at the page. "Is this your work stuff?" she said. "Yes." "Is it important?" He looked at her, her brown eyes, his eyes, very direct and very calm. "Yeah," he said. "I think it might be." She nodded. She slid the document back to him across the table. "Okay," she said. "Can I have the apple slices?" "Yes," he said. You can have the apple slices. She got up and went to the refrigerator, and he sat with the document in front of him and felt something that was larger than relief and smaller than certainty, but was moving in the right direction. Otsam. He spent the next 6 hours at the kitchen table. Mia fell asleep in her room at 9:30. He kept working. The circular routing structure, once he saw it, was clear enough that he could map the full cycle manually using the documents he had. Each cycle extracted approximately 3 to 4% of the transferred amount into a terminus account before the remainder was returned to the starting point. Small enough to look like transaction fees, large enough, over 2 years and hundreds of cycles, to add up to something significant. The terminus account was the key. It appeared in his documents only as a code, no bank identifier, no entity name, just an alphanumeric string that didn't match any format he recognized. He could not identify it from what he had. But Bellevue Analytics could. He emailed Sienna at 11:45. Not the full explanation. The email system was personal, but he was still careful. Just, I need to talk to you, tomorrow. Not over email. The Bellevue team needs to look at something specific. I found the extraction point. Her reply came at 12:03. I'll be at your building at 8. He stared at that for a moment. Then he went to sleep. She was there at 7:58, which was 2 minutes early, and which, for Sienna, meant on time. He buzzed her up and opened the door, and she was in the hallway in her coat, with her bag over her shoulder. And for a moment, the specific ordinary reality of Sienna Vaughn standing at his apartment door in Queens at 7:58 in the morning was something he had to process before he could move forward. Coffee? He said. Yes, she said. She came in and looked around the apartment, not intrusively, not commenting, just taking it in the way she took in everything. The kitchen table still covered in documents, Mia's drawings on the refrigerator, a small sneaker near the door that hadn't made it to the shoe rack. He poured coffee. She sat at the table, moving a folder to the side to make room. He walked her through it. The circular routing, Mia's identification of the pattern, the terminus account code, the extraction math. She listened without interrupting, looking at the documents as he laid them out. When he showed her the terminus code, she went still in the same way she had when she'd read her father's emails. That specific, absolute stillness, the body containing something the face won't show. This is the account the money actually ended up in, she said. Yes. Everything else was movement without net extraction. This is where it went. She looked at the code. She took out her phone and photographed the document. I'm calling Bellevue this morning. This is exactly the kind of string they can identify through the holding company registry. If there's a real entity behind this account, they'll find it. How long will it take? I'll tell them we need it in 48 hours. She looked up. The shareholder conference is in 3 weeks. Preston is pushing to resolve the audit findings before then, which means the board is going to move on your situation in the next 10 days, whether or not we have the full picture. So we have 10 days. Less, probably. She set her phone down. She looked at the document spread across his kitchen table, and then she looked at the apartment, the refrigerator with Mia's drawings, the ceiling light that had a slightly wrong angle because the fixture was old, the view through the window of the building across the narrow street. You built all of this here. I had time, he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression was different from the office versions, less assembled. Not because the assembly was gone, but because in his kitchen, at 8 in the morning, with documents spread between them and coffee going cold in their cups, the assembly was simply less relevant. She looked like a person rather than a position. The board is going to ask me to make a recommendation before the conference, she said, formally, about whether to pursue action against you. I know. If I don't have what I need in time, I'll have to delay it, which will look like I'm protecting you. Are you protecting me? He said. She held his gaze. I'm protecting the truth, she said, which happens to include the fact that you're innocent. He nodded. But it costs something, she said. For the record, it costs something. He understood what she meant. The company's trust in her judgment. The board's confidence in her objectivity. The specific credibility that a CEO spends years building and can lose faster than it accumulated. She was spending some of that right now, in this kitchen, and she was telling him she knew it. I know, he said. The apartment was quiet. Somewhere down the hallway, he heard Mia's door open. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the small stars on them. Sleep blurry and not fully oriented, her hair in the disaster it always was in the morning. She registered Sienna at the table and stopped, blinked. "You're here," she said to Sienna. "I'm here," Sienna said. Mia looked at her father. He gave her nothing, just watched. She looked back at Sienna with the recalibrating expression of a child deciding how to feel about an unexpected thing. "Did you have breakfast?" Mia asked Sienna. "Not yet." Mia looked at Grayson. "We should make eggs," she said, as though this were a logical conclusion. He looked at Sienna. She was looking at Mia with the same expression she'd had on the Saturday morning when Mia had taken her hand, that careful, slightly undone quality. Something in her that was not used to being in spaces like this one, and was not entirely sure what to do with itself. "Sure," he said. "We can make eggs." Bellevue called Sienna 43 hours later. She forwarded him the key finding through personal email, no preamble. The Terminus account code traced to a holding entity registered in Delaware called Whitmore Group LLC. Whitmore Group had been incorporated in 2016 and had one listed officer, Raymond Stahl. Grayson read the email standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down. The money from Edmund Vaughn's company, extracted systematically over 2 years through a circular routing structure designed to be invisible. The money that Edmund Vaughn had found and written a memo about and had been 3 months from exposing when he died suddenly at 58 years old in perfect health, had ended up in an account controlled by Raymond Stahl. He called Sienna. She answered on the second ring. "I saw it," he said. "Yes." "Is this enough?" "With the original documents, the transaction records, and the Bellevue report?" "Yes. It's enough for a federal referral." She paused. "It's more than enough." He heard something in her voice that was not triumph and was not relief and was something older and harder to name. The specific sound of a person arriving at the end of a very long road and finding it is real, that it was always real, that the years of carrying it were not a mistake. "Sienna," he said. "I know," she said, quietly. "I know." They were both silent for a moment. "The conference is in 2 weeks," she said. "Preston is going to call a board decision on your audit next week. I need to move before that." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give the board everything we have, not through official channels, not through Stahl's operations infrastructure, directly. I'm calling an emergency session Wednesday and I'm presenting it myself." "What about Stahl?" "He won't know until he's in the room." He thought about that. "That's risky. If he has any warning—" "He won't," she said. "I'm also calling the SEC and the FBI Tuesday night, before the board meeting. Whatever Stahl does after Wednesday, there will already be a federal inquiry underway that he can't stop." He absorbed this. She had thought it through. Of course she had. She had probably been thinking about the moment it would be enough for years, building the response in her head against the day the evidence arrived. "I want to be there," he said. "Wednesday, at the board meeting." A pause. "You're suspended." "I know. I want to be there anyway." Another pause. Longer. "Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock. Use the visitor entrance on 43rd. I'll have you cleared." "Thank you." She hung up. He put his phone down on the kitchen table. Through the window, the city was just starting to get light, the sky going from black to the specific dark gray that comes before dawn, the buildings beginning to separate themselves from the sky. Tuesday night, he put Mia to bed and sat on the edge of her bed for a few minutes after she'd fallen asleep, the specific still peace of watching a child sleep, the smallness of her in the bed, the even breathing, the absolute absence of the day's sharpness. He thought about the drawing with 4 figures. He thought about eggs on a Thursday morning, Sienna at his kitchen table, Mia in her star pajamas asking whether she'd had breakfast with the ordinary authority of someone who believes in the importance of breakfast. He thought about the fact that a 7-year-old had looked at a page of transaction records and seen a circle that 2 adults had missed. He tucked the blanket closer and turned off her lamp and went back to the kitchen. His phone buzzed. A text from Sienna's personal number, which she used rarely. Federal referral submitted. 11:47 p.m. It's done. He wrote back, "How are you?" A long pause. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "Ask me Thursday." He smiled at his phone in the dark kitchen. Then he put it down and went to bed. Wednesday morning was cold and overcast, the sky the flat white of incoming snow that hadn't committed yet. He wore his best suit, the one he'd pressed twice that first Monday, the collar finally right. He took the subway to Midtown and entered the Vaughn Media Building through the visitor entrance on 43rd and was handed a badge by the security desk that said visitor, but got him to 34. The boardroom was full, not just board members. There were senior executives, external auditors, and two people in the corner whom Grayson recognized as federal, just from the way they were standing. He learned later that Sienna had coordinated with the SEC and FBI to have observers present, not to conduct any official action, but to witness the presentation, which was a precise and careful way of making the board's response to the evidence a matter of public record before anyone in the room could move to suppress it. Raymond Stahl was already seated when Grayson entered. Stahl was 53 and compact, and had the particular steadiness of a man who had been careful for a very long time. He looked at Grayson entering the room, and something moved through his expression. Brief, controlled, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. And then it was gone, and he was looking at his phone. Thomas was also in the room. He was seated near the back wall, not at the table. When Grayson came in, Thomas looked at him and held his gaze for a moment, and something in his expression was different from the measuring cold of the past few months. Something more complicated, something that might have been the specific discomfort of a man who had made choices that he had convinced himself were practical and is now about to watch those choices become consequences. Sienna began at 9:02. She presented for 40 minutes without interruption. She went through Edmond Vaughn's memo, the original transaction records, the circular routing structure, the Terminus account, the Bellevue Analytics report, the Whitmore Group registration, and Raymond Stahl's name as the sole officer. She was methodical and precise, and entirely without theater. She did not editorialize. She did not narrate her own emotion. She let the evidence do the work that evidence is supposed to do. It was, Grayson thought, the most controlled thing he had ever watched a person do while presenting the story of their father's death. Stahl said nothing for the first 30 minutes. He was very still, the stillness of a man watching a structure he believed was buried being excavated piece by piece while he calculated the distance between himself and the exits. At minute 31, he said, "These documents are from an unsecured archive. The chain of custody is documented," Sienna said. "Metadata, access logs, authenticated copies submitted to federal counsel Tuesday evening." She looked at him. "The originals are with the SEC as of this morning." Stahl was quiet. At minute 38, Preston said, in a voice that had lost its practiced deliberation and replaced it with something more genuine and considerably less comfortable. "Raymond, is there anything you want to say to these findings?" Stahl looked at the table. He looked at the two federal observers in the corner. He looked at the documents in front of Sienna, which were copies. The originals, as she'd stated, were already with federal authorities, which meant there was nothing in this room to take or destroy or modify. He said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney." The room was quiet for a long time. Preston said, "I think that's probably wise." The board session was suspended. The federal observers moved from their corner. Stahl was escorted out of the building, not in handcuffs. That came later, during the formal arrest at his home the following morning, but in the company of two federal agents who were extremely clear about the conditions of his voluntary cooperation. Grayson stood near the door and watched him go. In the hallway afterward, Marcus found him. The older man looked drained and somewhat displaced, the way people look when the ground is shifted under something they'd been standing on without knowing it. He shook Grayson's hand with both of his. "I should have," Marcus started. "You didn't know," Grayson said. "I should have seen something." "He was here 11 years, Grayson said. "He was careful. That's what careful looks like. It's invisible until it isn't." Marcus nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else, then just squeezed Grayson's hand and walked away down the hall. Preston and the other board members found Grayson shortly after, and delivered a formal apology that was genuinely uncomfortable for all parties and therefore probably genuine. Preston was a man more used to institutional authority than to acknowledging institutional failure, and his discomfort with the second was visible. Grayson accepted it without making it easier than it was. He said, "I'd like my access restored and my record cleared in writing." And Preston said, "Of course," in the tone of a man who understood that of course was the minimum acceptable response to that request. Sienna found him last. The room had mostly cleared. The auditors were packing their materials. The 2 federal observers had gone. Outside the conference room windows, the flat white sky had finally committed to snow, light and early. The first of the season, soft against the glass. She stopped in front of him. She had held it together for the entire 40 minutes, the entire aftermath, the entire morning of documented professional excellence. Standing here now, in the nearly empty conference room with the snow coming down outside, some of the assembly was gone. Not all of it. She probably couldn't let all of it go in a conference room. But some. She looked at him. He looked back. "You came back," she said. "You cleared my badge," he said. "You would have come anyway." He considered that. "Probably," he said. She looked out the window at the snow. Something in her posture was different, less held, less braced. The weight of 4 years of looking for something without knowing what you were looking for and finding it has a specific aftermath that isn't immediately relief. It's something quieter and more complicated. He didn't know the right word for it. He wasn't sure there was one. "Your father found it," he said. She nodded, still looking at the snow. He was right. He had it. He stopped. "He just didn't have enough time," she said, quietly. Not in the boardroom voice, just her voice. They stood there for a moment, the 2 of them, in the near-empty room with the snow coming down and the city below doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with the specific human gravity of the moment happening 34 floors above it. Then her phone rang. She looked at it. "The federal contact," she said. And the assembly came back, not entirely but enough, the professional face settling into place with the specific practiced ease of someone who has worn it for a long time. She looked at him, one moment before she answered. "Thursday," she said. He understood. "Ask me Thursday." Last night's text. "Thursday," he agreed. She answered the phone. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood watching the numbers descend. Behind him, through the conference room windows, the snow kept falling. Thursday came the way days come after something large has happened. Ordinarily, without ceremony, the city doing its indifferent thing outside the window while Grayson made coffee and Mia ate cereal, and the morning assembled itself around them the same way it always had. He had not slept badly. He had expected the particular restless aftermath of high tension released, the body not knowing what to do with the absence of the thing it had been braced against. Instead, he had slept deeply and woken up at 6:15 to the sound of Mia already in the kitchen, which meant she had woken up hungry, which happened when she'd had a long day at school and hadn't eaten enough dinner. He found her standing on the step stool at the counter, attempting to pour cereal into a bowl, the box at an angle that was going to cause a problem. "Here," he said, and took the box. "I was doing it," she said. "You were about to do it all over the counter." She considered this. "I would have cleaned it up." "I know you would have." He poured the cereal, handed her the bowl, got out the milk. She climbed onto her stool at the kitchen table, and he made coffee and stood at the window while it brewed, looking at the street below, the early light on the buildings across the way, a woman walking a very small dog in a plaid coat. The dog in the coat, not the woman. "You seem different," Mia said behind him. He turned around. She was eating her cereal and looking at him with the direct brown eyes that were his eyes, that had always been his eyes. Different how? She thought about it. Like, yesterday was heavy, and today you put it down. He looked at her for a moment, 7 years old. He genuinely did not know how she did it. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." She nodded and went back to her cereal. He turned back to the window. The small dog in the plaid coat was gone. The street was doing its morning thing, filling up slowly with people who had their own waits and their own reasons and their own ordinary Thursdays to get through. He thought about Edmund Vaughn, who had found the truth and written it in a memo and had not lived to see it matter. He thought about the photograph on Sienna's credenza, a man and a young woman standing in front of a building before everything went wrong. He thought about what it costs to carry something for 4 years without knowing if the carrying will ever amount to anything. He thought about Sienna's text. Ask me Thursday. He poured his coffee. He took Mia to school. He came home and changed out of his school drop-off clothes into something better and took the subway to Midtown. She was in her office when he arrived. Her assistant, the young woman from his first day, the one with the carefully pulled back hair, waved him through without calling ahead, which told him Sienna had given standing instructions. He knocked anyway. Old habit. Come in, she said. The office was the same as it always was. Spare, glass, the city behind her, the photograph on the credenza, the legal pad on the desk. She was in a different suit from yesterday, which he registered only because yesterday's suit had been the one she'd been wearing when she presented 40 minutes of evidence about her father's death in front of a full board, and today's was simply a suit. She looked up when he came in. The full quality of her attention, the same as it had been from the beginning. No assembly over it today, or less of it. She looked like a person who had put something down and was still figuring out what to do with her hands now that they were empty. You asked me Thursday, she said. I did. Sit down. He sat across from her. The city was gray and cold outside the window, the first snow from yesterday gone already. The streets their usual winter damp gray. The federal inquiry is formally underway, she said. The SEC opened the investigation file yesterday afternoon. The FBI has the transaction records and the Bellevue report. The criminal case will take time. These things always take time. But Stahl's attorney contacted federal counsel this morning, which tells you what Stahl has already calculated about his position. He's going to cooperate, Grayson said. I think so. Whether fully or partially is what his attorney is negotiating right now. She looked at her legal pad. The board met again this morning without me, Preston called it. They're moving to formally clear your record and reinstate your position. There will be a written apology and a compensation package for the suspension period. Marcus told me. He texted last night. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at something on her desk that wasn't the legal pad. A small piece of paper, handwritten, that he couldn't read from where he was sitting. How are you? He said. She looked up. In the weeks he had known her, in the boardrooms and the client dinners and the small conference room on 32 and the 36-hour silence after his suspension, he had asked her how she was doing almost never, because she didn't inhabit that question comfortably, and he had known it. He asked it now because the answer mattered to him, and because she had said, "Ask me Thursday," and this was Thursday. She was quiet long enough that he thought she was going to deflect, which would have been fair, which would have been her right, which would have been the completely understandable response of a person who had spent years building a shell thick enough to run a company from inside. Then she said, I don't entirely know yet. He held her gaze. I had this idea that when it was over, when I knew, I would feel something definitive. She looked at the photograph on the credenza. I've been waiting to find out what happened for 4 years, and now I know, and it's... She stopped. It's not what I thought it would feel like. What does it feel like? Like the noise stopped, she said. Like something that has been running constantly in the background of everything for 4 years just stopped. And I don't know what to do with the quiet. She looked at him. Something in her expression was entirely unguarded for just a moment. I'm not very good at quiet. I know, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. Is that an observation or a diagnosis? It's just a thing I've noticed, he said. You work at 11:40 on Thursday nights. You send Mark up at 2 in the morning. You've been here before everyone and left after everyone since before I started. That's called running a company. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes it's called not knowing what to do when you stop moving. She looked at him for a long moment. The office was very quiet. Outside the window, the city was its enormous and different self, doing nothing to acknowledge the specific gravity of the room. Edmund would have liked you, she said. It came out more direct than she'd intended. Maybe He saw a small adjustment in her expression, something that had gotten out slightly further than she'd planned, but she didn't walk it back. He didn't know exactly what to do with that, so he sat with it for a moment before he said, "Tell me about him." And she did. Not briefly, not in the controlled summary she would have given a board member or a journalist or anyone in her professional life. She talked about her father the way people talk about people they have been grieving for a long time and have not had space to grieve properly, fully and without editing. How he had built the company from nothing in his mid-30s, how he had brought her into it at 22, not because she was his daughter, but because she was genuinely good at it and he had known it before she had. How he had a habit of buying too many flowers for the office and putting them in the wrong vases so they always looked slightly wrong. How he had been bad at cooking but made the same 3 things her whole childhood so reliably that she could still tell the season of a year by which of those 3 things she smelled. How the morning they called to tell her he was gone, she had been in this office, at this desk, and she had looked at the city through the window and made a decision in the first 60 seconds that she was not going to let whatever had happened to him happen to this company, not on her watch. And she had run it from that decision for 4 years without stopping. "That's a lot of weight to run a company from," Grayson said. "I know." She looked at her hands on the desk. "I think it was the only way I knew how to be close to it, close to him, keep building the thing he built." She paused. Which probably sounds like a lot of things a therapist would find interesting. "Probably," he agreed. Something moved through her expression, real, briefly unguarded. "I don't want to run it from that anymore," she said. "I want to run it because it's worth running, because the work is worth doing." She looked up at him. "You showed me that, actually, watching you work. You're not trying to prove anything. You just care about whether the thing is good." He didn't know what to say to that immediately. He settled for the truth. "The work is worth doing," he said, "and you're the best person I've ever worked for. And I've worked for people who charge $400 an hour to tell you how to be good at exactly that." She looked at him. "That's not flattery," he said. "You're exacting and you're difficult, and you sent me markup at 2 a.m. on a Friday, but you've never once asked me to do anything I thought was wrong. That matters. It matters more than most people realize until they've worked somewhere it isn't true." She was quiet. Outside the window, a cloud shifted and a brief angled light came through the glass and hit the side of her face, and she looked for a moment like the photograph on the credenza. Younger, something of the shell not yet fully in place, something that was simply a person rather than a position. "Grayson," she said. "Yes. I'm glad you didn't quit that first week." He looked at her. He thought about the board meeting, the observer's chair, the folder with its 41 job applications behind it. He thought about the suit he'd pressed twice. He thought about all the ways he'd almost not been here. "I almost did," he said. "The first Monday was not a great day." "I know." Something in her expression shifted. Not quite an apology. She didn't do apologies comfortably, but adjacent to one, the version of an apology she was capable of making. I am, not easy to work for." "No." "You didn't need me to be easy." "No," he said again. "I just needed the work to be real." She held his gaze. "It is," she said. "It was always real." He came back to Vaughn Media full-time the following Monday. His access credentials were restored, his record cleared, the written apology sitting in his HR file alongside a compensation agreement for the suspension period that was larger than he'd expected and about which he said nothing except thank you. His desk on 28 was exactly as he'd left it, except someone had cleaned the monitor. The floor felt different when he walked back in, not dramatically. Nobody stood up, nobody applauded. It wasn't that kind of place, but there was a quality of acknowledgement in the way people made eye contact with him that morning. Camille said, "Good to have you back," in a tone that was warmer than anything she'd said to him before. James stopped by his desk in the afternoon, ostensibly about the Horizon campaign timeline, actually to say, without saying it directly, that he was glad Grayson was there. Thomas was not on the floor. He was not at the company, Grayson eventually learned. He had taken a leave of absence the day after the board meeting, which meant he'd been given the option of a leave or a termination, and had chosen the option that preserved his dignity. Whether what Thomas knew or had done constituted anything legally actionable was apparently part of what the federal investigation would eventually determine, and Grayson had made a private decision not to think about Thomas more than necessary. He had been a complication and a warning, and now he was gone. And the floor worked better without the specific tension his presence had carried. Priya stopped by the kitchen the first morning and told him where the good coffee was. Again, the same way she'd told him the first week, as though offering him a second first day. He appreciated that more than she knew. The shareholder conference happened 3 weeks later, in a ballroom on the 4th floor of a hotel in Midtown that had the specific formal grandeur of an event designed to communicate institutional stability. 2 days, presentations and panels and dinners, and the controlled performance of organizational health that such events require. The first day was largely operational. Department heads presenting year-end results, forward projections, the mechanics of the company's performance and trajectory. Grayson presented on behalf of the Creative Strategy Division a 20-minute overview of the accounts that had been rebuilt and the methodology changes he'd introduced, the Northbridge numbers and the Horizon trajectory, and the Ardent retention that had been rescued. He was straightforward about what had been broken and what had been fixed and what the forward position looked like. Davis Park was in the audience and gave him a small nod when he finished. That meant more than it looked like. The second day was when Sienna presented. She gave a 45-minute address to shareholders, investors, and board members that was unlike anything Grayson had heard her do before, not because the precision was gone. The precision was always going to be there, but because something else was present alongside it. She talked about the company's past year with honesty that was unusual in a shareholder context, which is an environment that generally rewards optimism over accuracy. She acknowledged what had nearly happened to the company's integrity. She talked about what she was building, and she did not talk about it the way a CEO talks about growth metrics. She talked about it the way someone talks about a thing they genuinely care about, a thing they want to still be standing in 20 years, a thing worth protecting. She talked about her father. Not extensively, not sentimentally, but directly. She said his name, Edmund Vaughn, and she said he had built this company on the belief that good work and honest dealing were not obstacles to success, but the foundation of it, and that the past year had shown her how much of that foundation was still intact, even when it had been under pressure. In the audience, Grayson was very still. He had not known she was going to say that. He watched the room while she spoke. The investors recalibrating, the board members steady, the employees from Vaughn Media who had been invited scattered through the audience. Some of them visibly moved in the way people are moved when someone in authority says something real in a formal context, which happens rarely enough to matter when it does. She finished to applause that was genuine rather than obligatory, and came down from the stage and found, as these events find her, a series of people who needed to speak with her immediately. He watched her move through them, precise, gracious, the professional apparatus running at full capacity. And eventually she was standing near the edge of the room in the brief gap between one conversation ending and another beginning, and she looked up and found him watching. He lifted his chin slightly. She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that didn't need language. The months that followed had the texture of a different kind of life. Stahl's cooperation with federal authorities was substantive. He provided documentation of the full scheme, named the offshore intermediaries, and confirmed what the transaction records had implied, that Edmund Vaughn's death had not been natural, that a man who had worked for the company as a security consultant in 2019 and who had since left the country had been responsible, and that Stahl had known and had covered it and had continued to extract money from the company for 4 more years on the calculation that it would never be found. The criminal case moved at the pace these cases move. There were delays in filings and the particular glacial machinery of federal justice, which is not built for speed. Stahl was eventually convicted on 11 counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The sentencing came 14 months after the boardroom, and Grayson watched the coverage on his phone on a Tuesday morning while Mia ate breakfast. And then he put his phone face down and helped Mia find her missing shoe, which was under the radiator, where it always ended up. The man who had been responsible for Edmund Vaughn's death was located by international authorities and extradited. That case took longer. Sienna did not speak publicly about it during the investigation, and Grayson did not ask her to. There were things she was processing that were hers to process at her own pace, and he had learned over the months they had been building something together, tiras, carefully, not easily, in the imperfect way of two people who are both more accustomed to doing things alone, that she needed room rather than pressure. She was not easy to love. He had known that before he knew he loved her, which was the specific order of things for someone like Sienna, who made it impossible to misunderstand her in the early stages, and then ambushed you later with something that was tender and real and entirely unannounced. She did not do things the expected way. When she first came to Grayson's apartment not for work, no documents, no strategy, it was on a Sunday afternoon in February because Mia had called her. Mia had gotten Sienna's personal number from Grayson's phone in a move of operational boldness that Grayson had discovered only afterward, and had texted Sienna a photograph of a horse drawing she had made that week, and then added, as a follow-up text, "My dad made soup if you want some." Sienna had shown up at 4 with a bottle of good wine and a genuine uncertainty in her face that she wore like someone not entirely sure of their footing, but not willing to stop walking, and they had eaten soup and Mia had shown her the horse drawing at length, and Grayson had not once tried to manage the situation because the situation was managing itself better than he could have. She had stayed until 9. On the way out, she had crouched down to say goodbye to Mia, and Mia had hugged her. Spontaneous, full commitment, both arms, the way she hugged Grayson, and something went through Sienna's face that was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on it, a look of being received by something that asked nothing of her in return. And she held the hug for a moment longer than necessary, and then stood up and looked at Grayson and said, in a voice that was about 2 degrees away from steady, "Good soup." "Thanks," he said. She left. He closed the door. Behind him, Mia said, "She cried a little bit." "I know." "That's okay." "I know it is," he said. He was promoted to Chief Creative Officer 8 months after the boardroom, in a restructuring that Sienna drove over 2 months of careful planning and that reshaped the creative and strategy functions of the company from the ground up. The promotion was not a gift. She had made him work for every increment of it, questioned his proposals rigorously, pushed back on 3 of his structural recommendations before accepting them with modifications that were, he had to admit, better than what he'd proposed. He would not have wanted it any other way. He was not someone who needed to win every argument, but he was someone who needed to know that the arguments were real. The new structure redistributed authority that had been concentrated in operations under Stahl's tenure and spread it across departments in ways that built in redundancy and visibility. The specific kind of structural change that doesn't make headlines but makes a company healthier in the way that good sleep makes a person healthier, quietly and cumulatively, and in ways you only fully appreciate when you remember what the alternative felt like. Sienna asked Grayson to lead the internal culture work, not as an HR exercise, but as a genuine rebuilding project, a conversation with people at every level of the company about what had been wrong and what they wanted it to look like going forward. He did this over 4 months, in small group sessions and one-on-one conversations, and a company-wide forum that Sienna opened and then stepped back from to let other people speak. What came back was not uniformly flattering, and some of it was hard to hear, and they heard it anyway. Fear was the theme that came up most consistently. People had been afraid. Not of Sienna. She was demanding and exacting, but she was also fair, and her directness, it turned out, was something most people preferred once they adjusted to it. They had been afraid of the structures around her, of the opacity, of the feeling that information moved in one direction and accountability moved in the other, of Thomas, who had been quietly obstructive in ways that were difficult to document but that people had felt for years, of Stahl, who had run operations with an authority that had no counterweight. Grayson wrote a report on all of it. It was long and unflattering in places and carefully honest throughout, and Sienna read it twice and then sat across from him in the small conference room on 32, their room, the one with the broken standing desk folded against the wall, and said, "This is going to require some difficult conversations with people who've been here a long time." "Yes," he said. "Some of them won't like it." "No. Some of them will leave. Some will. Some will stay, and it'll be better. Some will stay, and it won't, and we'll have to address that directly. He looked at her. There's no version of this that doesn't require you to be willing to lose people. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I've been losing people my whole life. I'm not afraid of it. He looked at her for a moment. That's not entirely true, he said, carefully. She was quiet. Something moved through her expression, not defensiveness, which he'd been prepared for, but recognition. The look of someone being accurately seen and deciding whether to resist it. No, she said finally. It's not entirely true. That conversation lasted 2 hours and covered ground that was professional and personal and couldn't be cleanly separated into which was increasingly true of most conversations they had, and which Grayson had stopped trying to separate because the separation had always been slightly artificial anyway. The work was real, and the people doing the work were real, and the line between the two had always been more porous than the professional world liked to pretend. The charity gala in November was the company's first major public event since the restructuring, a fundraiser for a media literacy organization that Sienna had supported for years, held at a venue in the West Village that was warm and well lit and not trying too hard, which was increasingly the aesthetic standard she applied to things she was personally involved in. Mia was there. Grayson had debated bringing her. Galas were adult events, formal and long, not designed for 7-year-olds. But she had asked, specifically and directly in the manner of a person who has thought about a request before making it. And he had said yes because she almost always had a reason for the things she asked for, even when she didn't articulate it, and he had learned to trust that. She wore a dark blue dress that she had chosen herself, and small shoes that she had also chosen herself, and had an expression all evening of a person who is taking everything in without showing how much. She sat with Grayson at the table through the dinner portion and ate approximately half of everything on her plate and asked him quiet questions about the people she was observing. Not intrusively, just orienting herself, building a map of the room. When Sienna spoke from the stage, briefly, about the organization, about why media literacy was worth funding, about the relationship between information and power in a way that was substantive without being a lecture, Mia watched her the whole time and afterwards said to Grayson quietly, "She's different when a lot of people are watching." How is she different? Mia thought about it. More careful, like she's making sure each word goes where she means it to. He looked at his daughter. That's exactly right, he said. Mia seemed satisfied with this and went back to what was left of her dessert. The evening moved through its phases. The presentations, the program, the loosening that happens after the formal portion ends, and people stand in small groups with their drinks, and the room becomes something less structured. Grayson made his way through several conversations, a few of them professional, a few of them social, one of them with Davis Park, who was there with his wife, and who shook Grayson's hand warmly and said the Horizon campaign had outperformed projections by 19%, which was the kind of number that made a year's work feel like more than its parts. At some point in the evening, Grayson found himself standing near the edge of the room, a glass of wine in hand, watching the room rather than being in it. He did this sometimes, stepped to the edge of things to see the shape of them. It was a habit that had served him well, and also occasionally made people think he was aloof, which he was not. He was just a person who needed to see the whole thing before he trusted any piece of it. He was thinking about the fact that a year ago he had been sitting at a kitchen table in Queens at 5:45 in the morning, pressing a suit that didn't fit quite perfectly, hoping that this job, the 42nd application, was going to be the one that held. He was thinking about Mia eating oatmeal with chocolate chips, and 41 rejection emails, and a one-bedroom apartment with a dripping faucet, and the specific quality of fear that is not dramatic but is structural. The fear of a person who has been responsible for someone else's entire world and is aware, at all times, of the weight of that. He was thinking about Edmund Vaughn's memo in an unsecured archive, and Mia's finger tracing a circle through transaction records at the kitchen table, and a text at 11:47 at night that said, "It's done." He was thinking about all the ways the year could have gone differently, the ways he could have missed the folder, the ways he could have gone to Marcus instead of Sienna, the ways he could have taken the suspension as the signal it was designed to be, leave, be quiet, go away, and had. He had not. Not because he was fearless, because he had been more afraid of the alternative. He was still in that thought when Sienna appeared beside him, appearing the way she appeared in doorways, quietly, without announcement, already present before you'd processed the transition. She was looking at the room too. They stood side by side for a moment, not talking. Mia ate the dessert, she said. She always eats the dessert. She told me she's reading a new book, not horses this time. Detectives, he said. It's a mystery series. She's on the third one. She explained the plot to me for about 8 minutes. She does that. I know, Sienna said. And there was something in the way she said it, the ease of it, the specific warmth of I know in that context from someone who had not, a year ago, known anything about Mia or oatmeal or chocolate chips or horses, that caught in his chest. He looked at her. She was still looking at the room, a woman he had watched chair a board meeting and face down a federal inquiry and present 40 minutes of evidence about her father without letting her voice waver once. A woman who sent markup at 2 a.m. and made him rebuild entire sections of models that were already good because she believed in the standard of better. A woman who had stood in his kitchen and talked about her father, finally, after 4 years, in the voice that was simply her voice rather than her professional voice. A woman who had cried a little bit when a 7-year-old hugged her and then pretended she hadn't, and who everybody at the table had understood perfectly. Can I tell you something? He said. She turned to look at him. The reason I didn't quit that first week, he said, it wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't because I needed the job, although I did. It was because the work was real here, and I had been in enough places where it wasn't to know the difference. He paused. That was true then. It's been true every day since. She was looking at him the way she sometimes looked at things she was deciding whether to trust, that quality of attention, assembling and processing. But it was different now. The assembly was not armor. It was just how she thought. Grayson, she said. Yes. I know what you're going to do, she said. He looked at her. Do you? Mia told me, she said, and her voice had something in it that was almost, not quite, but almost the version of her that laughed, that had surfaces that weren't cut from glass, that held his coffee cup once on a Wednesday morning when his hands were full and handed it back without making it a thing. She told me this afternoon she can't keep a secret. She's 7. She's terrible at it. I know, he said. I've never been able to surprise her with a birthday present. Sienna looked at him with the warm, direct, slightly undone quality that she had only in certain rooms. His kitchen, the small conference room on 32, and here, at the edge of this room, with the party moving around them and the November night outside the windows, and the year of everything they had been through sitting between them like a country they had both crossed separately and arrived at together. He reached into his jacket pocket. Not with ceremony set. He didn't do ceremony well, and she didn't need it, and the moment didn't require anything it didn't already have. He held the ring in his hand. Simple, clean, not flashy. He had chosen it the way he chose most things, by looking at what it actually was rather than what it was supposed to be. I'm not going to do a speech, he said. You know how I feel. You've known for a while. Yes, she said, and I know how you feel. You told me in your own way, which is usually different from how other people tell you things, but I've learned to read it. Something moved through her face, the full, unguarded version of her, the one that existed underneath every professional iteration, the one that had appeared when a little girl hugged her in a kitchen and when she said, "Ask me Thursday," and when she talked about her father finally after 4 years. So, he said, I'm asking. She looked at him. He looked back. The room did what rooms do. People moved through it. Conversations happened. Glasses clinked somewhere nearby. November happened outside the windows. None of it was the point. Yes, she said, simply, directly, with the specific quality of a woman who means what she says and always has. He put the ring on her hand. She looked at it for a moment. Not the way you look at a thing you're evaluating, but the way you look at something that is real and unexpected even when you were expecting it. The way certain truths land even when you knew they were coming. Behind them, from somewhere at the table they'd left, came Mia's voice, sharp and delighted, and entirely too loud for the room. She said yes! The table near them broke into quiet laughter. Davis Park, 3 people away, started a small applause that 2 other tables picked up. Sienna looked at Grayson with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and the thing that lived right next to exasperated when the source of it is someone you love. She knew, Sienna said. She knew, Grayson agreed. She can't keep a secret. No, she really can't. Sienna looked across the room at Mia, who was standing on the rung of her chair with both arms raised, entirely unashamed, a small girl who had decided a year ago that this was how things were going to go and had simply waited for everyone else to catch up. Sienna's expression, looking at her, was the most completely open thing Grayson had ever seen on her face. Love, undisguised and unmanaged, the kind that had arrived without asking permission and taken up residence and was not going anywhere. "Come here," Sienna called to her. Mia got down from the chair and came across the room at her usual velocity, and Sienna caught her and held her in a way that was not careful or assembled or anything except simply what it was. And Mia said, against her shoulder, "I only told 2 people," which made Grayson close his eyes briefly because he knew that meant Mia had told at minimum 6. They were married this following autumn, on a clear October evening on a rooftop in Lower Manhattan, with the skyline spread out behind them and the specific late light of October doing its generous thing on the buildings and the water. Small ceremony. 30 people, chosen carefully. Marcus was there, and Priya, and Davis Park and his wife, and Camille, who had become something closer to a friend in the years since everything changed. Sienna's side of the room was smaller. She had fewer people she let close, and she had never apologized for that, and Grayson had never asked her to. Edmund Vaughn's photograph was not at the ceremony, but Sienna carried something of his in her jacket pocket. A small piece of paper, folded, the same piece Grayson had seen on her desk the Thursday after the boardroom and had never asked about. He didn't ask about it now either. He understood it without needing to name it. Mia was the flower girl and took the role with the seriousness of a professional, walking down the makeshift aisle with the focused deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing and intends to get it right. She got it right. She also, afterward, gave a small toast that nobody had asked her to give, which was 2 sentences long and which she had apparently prepared entirely on her own. "I always knew we needed 4 people in the drawing. Now we have 4 people in real life." She sat down. There was a silence and then laughter that was warm and real and slightly wet-eyed. Grayson looked at Sienna. Sienna was looking at Mia with the expression she always wore when Mia surprised her, which was often, that careful, slightly undone quality, as though the world kept coming at her in a form she hadn't anticipated, and she kept finding, against her expectations, that she could take it. She reached across and took his hand. Not dramatically, not like a moment in a story, just took his hand, the ordinary warm weight of it, the way you take something that is simply yours now. He thought, briefly and without sentimentality, about everything that had had to go wrong to get to this specific Thursday evening on a New York rooftop with the lights of the city coming on one by one as the October dark came in. The folded company, the 41 applications, the dripping faucet, the bad nights when Mia was asleep and the apartment was quiet, and quiet felt like the wrong kind of thing. The suit pressed twice, the collar finally right. He had believed in those years that what he was doing was surviving, making it work, getting through. He understood now that he had been wrong about that, or not wrong exactly, but incomplete, that surviving is not a lesser thing than living, but is sometimes the form that living takes when the conditions are hard. That the years he had been getting through had been, at the same time, the years he had been becoming someone who could sit in an observer's chair in a boardroom and not flinch. Someone who could read a memo in a buried archive and understand what it meant, and go to the person who needed to know it. Someone who had learned from a 7-year-old who drew 4 figures in every house picture, whether anyone asked her to or not, that the shape of a family is not something you find or something that arrives. It is something you build slowly, from the people who are willing to keep showing up. The city got its lights on. The October air was cold and clean. Mia was telling someone at the next table the plot of her detective book. Marcus was laughing at something. Sienna's hand was in his, and she was looking out at the skyline with the expression he had come to know best. Not the boardroom face, not the controlled processing face, not any of the versions she wore for the world's benefit, but the one that was simply hers, looking at the city that had been the backdrop of her entire life, the city where she had lost her father and built a company from grief and found, without looking for it, a family. Not perfect, not smooth, not the kind of story that pretends the hard parts were worth it, because they led here. The hard parts were just hard, and the good parts were good, and neither explained or justified the other. That was the truth of it. That was the only honest version. But they were here on a rooftop in October, with the lights coming on across the water. That was enough. That had always been, if you were paying attention, more than enough.